Caleb Vance had survived drought, outlaws, and the brutal frontier sun, but nothing prepared him for the woman who stepped off that train. She wasn't the gentle bride he'd been promised. She was armed, dangerous, and running from something that would burn his entire world to ash. When riders appeared on the horizon with murder in their eyes, Caleb realized the terrible truth. He hadn't brought home a wife. He'd brought home a war. This is a story of fire, blood, and survival in the lawless West. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The desert wind carried the scent of creosote and dust across the weathered platform where Caleb Vance stood, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. The train's whistle had fallen silent 10 minutes ago, its black iron body shimmering with heat as passengers scattered like tumbleweeds into the small depot town of Copper Ridge. He watched them go, families reuniting, merchants collecting goods, cowboys heading straight for the saloon, until only the empty platform remained. And one woman. She stood at the far end of the platform, a solitary figure in black that seemed to drink in the sunlight rather than reflect it. Not the pale gray traveling dress he'd been expecting, not the tentative posture of a woman arriving in unfamiliar territory. This woman stood like she owned the ground beneath her boots, her hand resting on something at her hip that made Caleb's jaw tighten. A gun. He'd been waiting 3 months for this moment. 3 months since he'd sent the letter east through the marriage agency, describing his ranch and his need for a partner in the plainest terms he could manage. He hadn't lied, told them straight that life out here was hard, that he needed someone practical more than pretty, someone who could handle isolation and work without complaint. The agency had written back with a name, Margaret Chen, a widow from Sacramento, educated, experienced in household management, seeking a fresh start. The photograph they'd sent showed a woman with soft features and kind eyes, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a high-collared dress that spoke of respectability and quiet strength. The woman walking toward him now bore no resemblance to that photograph. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to danger, her boots striking the wooden planks with deliberate purpose. As she drew closer, Caleb could make out more details. Black hair pulled back in a severe braid, sharp features that might have been beautiful if they weren't set in such hard lines, and eyes that scanned everything: the depot building, the empty street beyond, the mesa rising in the distance, with the trained assessment of a scout reading enemy territory. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to maintain defensive space. "Caleb Vance?" Her voice was lower than he'd expected, carrying an edge like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. That's right. He kept his own voice steady, though his mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. "And you are?" "Lian Zhou." She didn't offer her hand, didn't smile, didn't show any of the nervous uncertainty that might be expected from a woman meeting her intended husband for the first time. "I'm taking Margaret Chen's place." The words hung in the air between them like gun smoke. Caleb felt his hand drift toward the Colt at his own hip, an instinctive response to the wrongness of the situation. "Taking her place," he repeated slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like." Lian's eyes flicked past him, scanning the street again. Whatever she was looking for, she clearly didn't see it yet. "I bought her ticket. I have her papers. For all legal purposes, I'm the woman you contracted to marry." "For all legal purposes." Caleb let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You mind telling me what the hell is actually going on?" "I mind very much." Lian's hand hadn't moved from her hip, where he could now see the carved wooden grip of a well-maintained pistol. "But what I mind doesn't matter. What matters is getting away from this depot before—" She stopped mid-sentence, her entire body going still in a way that raised every hair on the back of Caleb's neck. He'd seen that kind of stillness before, in men who'd learned to survive by sensing danger before it arrived. "Before what?" he demanded. Lian's eyes had locked onto something behind him. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Before they realize where I went." Caleb turned, following her gaze to the far end of the street where the road bent around the general store. 3 riders had appeared, their horses moving at an easy walk that somehow felt wrong. Too casual, too deliberate, like predators that had already caught the scent of wounded prey. Even from this distance, Caleb could see they weren't local. The way they sat their horses, the way their eyes swept the street with cold precision, the way their hands stayed near their weapons. These were men accustomed to violence, comfortable with it in a way that made honest folks cross to the other side of the street. Friends of yours? He kept his voice level, but his hand had settled on his Colt's grip. Not even close. Leanne had shifted position slightly, putting the depot's corner post between herself and the rider's line of sight. We need to leave. Now. Like hell. You want to tell me what I'm getting into first? There's no time. She grabbed his arm, and the urgency in her grip was genuine. You can leave me here and ride away, or you can take me to your ranch and we'll have this conversation somewhere they can't corner us. But standing here debating it gets us both killed. The riders had stopped in front of the saloon, their leader dismounting with the easy confidence of a man who'd never faced serious resistance. He was tall, wearing a long coat despite the heat, and when he turned his head to scan the street, Caleb caught a glimpse of hard features and eyes like chips of flint. One of the other riders pointed toward the depot. Damn it, Caleb made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He'd been a fool before, trusted the wrong people, paid prices that still woke him in the night. But he'd also learned to read situations, and this situation was screaming danger in a language he understood all too well. Wagons around back, move! Leanne didn't need to be told twice. She followed him at a quick walk that didn't quite break into a run, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while putting distance between themselves and the street. Caleb's wagon sat where he'd left it, hitched to two sturdy horses that had been standing patiently in the shade of the depot's back wall. Get in, he ordered, climbing up to the driver's seat and taking the reins. Leanne swung up beside him with the ease of someone who'd spent plenty of time in saddles and wagons. As Caleb urged the horses forward, she pulled her gun. A beautiful piece of craftsmanship, he noticed, with custom grips and the kind of maintenance that spoke of professional pride. If shooting starts, she said, checking the cylinder with quick, practiced movements, don't try to be a hero, just drive. If shooting starts, Caleb replied, guiding the horses onto the narrow road that led away from town, you better hope you're as good with that thing as you look. Better. There was no boast in her voice, just statement of fact. They made it half a mile before Caleb risked a look back. The road behind them was empty, the town shrinking to a cluster of buildings wavering in the heat shimmer. For a moment, he let himself hope that maybe they'd made it, that maybe whoever those men were, they hadn't connected Leanne to the woman who'd stepped off the train. Then he saw the dust. 3 plumes rising from the desert floor, moving fast and getting faster. Company, he said, snapping the reins to push the horses to greater speed. Leanne had already seen them. She'd turned in her seat, bracing herself against the wagon's frame, her gun steady in her hand. How far to your ranch? 10 miles? Maybe 12? The wagon bounced over a rut in the road, making them both grab for purchase. We're not going to make it at this pace. Not with them on horseback. Then we don't run to the ranch. Leanne's eyes swept the landscape with the same calculating assessment she'd given the depot. There. That canyon system to the west. How well do you know it? Caleb followed her gaze to where the land broke into a series of arroyos and narrow passages, carved over centuries by flash floods and wind. He'd hunted through those canyons, knew some of the passages and dead ends, but they were treacherous even for someone familiar with them. Well enough, he said. You thinking what I think you're thinking? Unless you have a better idea for evening the odds. She glanced at him, and for the first time he saw something other than cold calculation in her expression, a flicker of grim humor. I assume you can shoot? Been doing it since I was tall enough to hold a rifle. Good, because they're closing fast. She was right. The riders had gained considerable ground, near enough now that Caleb could make out details. The leader in his long coat, a second man with a rifle already unslung from his saddle, a third leaning low over his horse's neck to coax more speed from the animal. Caleb yanked the reins hard left, sending the wagon careening off the main road onto a barely visible track that led toward the canyon entrance. The horses protested, but he pushed them harder, knowing that the rough terrain would slow the riders more than it would slow them. The canyon mouth opened before them like a wound in the earth, its walls rising 30 feet on either side, narrowing to a passage barely wide enough for the wagon. Caleb guided the horses into it without slowing, the walls closing around them and blocking out half the sky. "This is good," Leon said, already moving. "Stop here. Unhitch the horses." "What? Why?" "Trust me. Do it now." There was something in her voice, not quite command, but absolute certainty, that made Caleb obey before his conscious mind caught up with the decision. He pulled the horses to a stop and jumped down, working the hitches with hands that had performed this task 1,000 times. The leather straps came free, and he led the horses deeper into the canyon where an outcropping provided some shelter. When he turned back, Leon had already taken position behind the wagon, using it as a barricade. She'd pulled a second gun from somewhere. He hadn't even noticed she was carrying it, and now she crouched there with a weapon in each hand, her eyes fixed on the canyon entrance. "Get down," she said, "and when I start shooting, you shoot too. Aim for the horses if you can't hit the riders. We need to make them think twice about charging in here." Caleb dropped beside her, drawing his Colt and checking the loads. "You want to tell me who these people are?" "Men who work for someone with a lot of money and no conscience." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "They'll kill you just for being in their way. So when they come through that entrance, don't hesitate." The thunder of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, growing louder, closer. Caleb could feel his heartbeat matching the rhythm, that familiar tightening in his chest that came before violence. He'd been in fights before, killed men when he had to, but there was something different about this. The cold-blooded calculation of it, the way Leon waited with the patience of a hunter in a blind. The first rider appeared at the canyon entrance, his horse's hooves throwing up dust as he reined to a sudden stop. The leader in the long coat, close enough now that Caleb could see the scar running down his left cheek, the cruel set of his mouth. "Leon Joe!" The man's voice boomed through the canyon, echoing off the walls. "You've led us on a fine chase, girl, but it's over now. Send out those ledgers and we'll make this quick. You have my word." Leon didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even blink. The rider shifted in his saddle, trying to peer into the shadows where they were hidden. "You hear me? There's nowhere left to run. This canyon's got one way in and one way out, and we're sitting on it. You can die easy or die hard, but either way, those ledgers are coming back with us." Still, Leon said nothing. Caleb could see the other two riders flanking their leader now, spreading out to cover the entrance. The one with the rifle had it raised, scanning for targets. The third had drawn a pistol, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "Last chance," the leader called. "Send them out now or we come in and take them." Leon raised her left-hand gun in a smooth, practiced motion and fired. The shot cracked through the canyon like thunder, echoing and re-echoing until it sounded like a dozen guns firing at once. The bullet caught the leader's horse in the shoulder, sending the animal screaming and rearing, throwing its rider backward onto the hard-packed earth. Before the echo faded, Leon fired again with her right-hand gun, the bullet sparking off the canyon wall near the rifleman's head. He jerked back, his horse bolting sideways in panic. "Now!" Leon shouted. Caleb fired, his first shot going wide as the third rider spurred forward. He adjusted, fired again, and saw the man's hat fly off as the bullet passed close enough to part his hair. The rider wheeled his horse around, retreating to better cover. The canyon erupted into chaos. The horses were screaming, the men were shouting, and the sound of gunfire bounced off the walls until it became a continuous roar that made Caleb's ears ring. He kept firing methodically, making each shot count, forcing the riders to keep their heads down and their horses moving. Beside him, Leon was a revelation. She moved between targets with fluid precision, her gun speaking in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. Left, right, each shot placed exactly where she wanted it. She wasn't trying to kill them, Caleb realized. She was hurting them, controlling their movements, keeping them off balance and defensive. The leader had regained his feet and was screaming orders, but his men were in no position to follow them. One had lost his horse entirely, the animal having bolted back down the road. The rifleman was pinned behind a boulder, unable to get a clear shot. The third rider was trying to control his panicked mount with one hand while returning fire with the other, his shots going wild. "Reload," Leanne said, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "I'll cover." Caleb dropped behind the wagon fully, fumbling fresh cartridges from his belt and thumbing them into the Colt cylinder. His hands were steady, muscle memory from years of practice, but his mind was racing. These weren't just hired guns, these were professionals. And they'd been hunting Leanne with the kind of determination that spoke of serious consequences if they failed. What the hell had she stolen? "Ready," he said, rising back to firing position. Leanne had already dropped both her pistols and pulled something from inside her jacket. It took Caleb a moment to recognize it, a stick of dynamite, fuse already lit. "You're insane," he breathed. "Probably." She stood, exposed for a crucial second, and hurled the explosive toward the canyon entrance with the accuracy of a professional pitcher. "Get down!" They both dropped flat as the dynamite arced through the air, trailing smoke. The leader saw it coming and screamed a warning, but there was nowhere to go. The stick hit the ground 10 feet from the canyon entrance and detonated with a force that shook the earth. The blast was contained and amplified by the canyon walls, the concussion wave rolling over them like a physical thing. Dust and rock fragments rained down, and for a moment Caleb couldn't see anything through the thick cloud of debris. When it cleared, the canyon entrance had changed. A section of the wall had collapsed, sending tons of rock cascading down to partially block the passage. Not completely, there was still a gap wide enough for a man on foot, but it would stop the horses, buy them precious time. Through the settling dust, Caleb could see the riders retreating, dragging their wounded leader with them. One of them was shouting something, but the ringing in Caleb's ears turned it into meaningless noise. Leanne was already moving, checking her weapons, reloading with practiced efficiency. "That won't stop them long," she said. "They'll go around, find another way in. We need to move deeper, find a defensive position we can actually hold. Or we could use this time to actually talk." Caleb grabbed her arm, forcing her to face him. "You just brought a war to my doorstep, lady. I think I deserve to know why." For a moment he thought she might pull away, shut him out again. But then something shifted in her expression, not quite softening, but acknowledging the debt she owed him. "Fine," she said, "but we talk while we move. Those men work for the Blackwood Syndicate. Ever heard of them?" Caleb's blood ran cold. Everyone on the frontier had heard of Blackwood, a loose organization of land speculators, railroad magnates, and corrupt officials who'd been systematically buying up territory across the West, usually at gunpoint. Towns that refused to sell burned to the ground. Families that resisted disappeared in the night. The law looked the other way because the law was bought and paid for. "Jesus," he muttered, "what did you do to get Blackwood on your trail?" "I stole their account ledgers." Leanne had moved to the horses, checking them for injuries from the blast. 3 books full of names, dates, bribes, murders, everything they've done for the past 5 years, all documented in their own hand. Evidence that could bring down half the crooked politicians in 3 territories. And they want it back. More than want. They need it back. Without those ledgers, they're vulnerable. With them, I can destroy their entire operation. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Caleb saw something in her eyes that might have been regret. "I'm sorry I brought this to you. I thought I'd have more time, thought they'd lost my trail in Sacramento. But if you want to cut me loose right now, I won't blame you. This isn't your fight." Caleb considered it. He really did. The smart play was obvious. Leave her here with some supplies and one of the horses, ride hard for his ranch, and pretend this whole disaster had never happened. The Blackwood Syndicate had no reason to come after him if he wasn't harboring their fugitive. But then he thought about what those ledgers represented. All those murders, all those families destroyed, all those corrupt officials who'd sold their souls and their oaths for Blackwood gold. He thought about his own father, who'd fought to build an honest life on this land and died believing that the law meant something, that justice existed out here in the wild places. And he thought about the kind of man who'd ride away and leave a woman to face killers alone, even if that woman had brought the danger on herself. "Hell with that," he said. "My ranch is 10 miles east. It's got stone walls, good water, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. If Blackwood wants those ledgers, they'll have to go through both of us." Something flickered across Leanne's face, surprise, maybe, or gratitude. "You don't know what you're signing up for." "Then you better spend the next 10 miles educating me." Caleb gathered the horse's reins and started deeper into the canyon. "Because if we're going to war with the Blackwood Syndicate, I'd like to know exactly how screwed we are." They moved through the canyon in tense silence, leading the horses over treacherous ground while watching the walls above for signs of pursuit. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to barely shoulder width, sometimes opening into wider chambers where ancient floods had carved amphitheaters from the stone. After 20 minutes, Leon began to talk. "I used to work for them," she said, her voice echoing softly off the walls. "Not directly. I was hired security for one of their subsidiary operations in California. Didn't know who I was really working for at first. Thought it was just a legitimate land development company." "When did you figure it out?" "When they ordered me to burn down a church with the pastor's family still inside." Her voice remained level, but Caleb heard the anger underneath. "Some small farming community that wouldn't sell their land. Blackwood wanted to make an example. I refused. They tried to kill me for it." "But you survived." "Obviously." A ghost of dark humor. "I'm good at surviving, but I knew I couldn't just run. They'd hunt me forever, and they'd kill anyone who helped me. So I broke into their San Francisco office and stole the only thing they couldn't afford to lose, their insurance policy. They're proof that they owned all those judges and marshals and territorial administrators. Without those ledgers, they're just another gang of criminals." They emerged from the canyon system onto a stretch of open desert, the sun now low enough to paint the landscape in shades of orange and red. In the distance, Caleb could see the familiar outline of his ranch, a sturdy stone house his father had built, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. "There," he said, pointing. "We can make it before dark if we ride hard." They mounted the horses bareback, leaving the wagon behind as a sacrifice to speed. Caleb pushed his mount to a gallop, feeling Leon keeping pace beside him. The wind tore at their clothes and hair as they raced across the desert, the ranch growing larger with each passing minute. He risked a glance back and saw them. 4 riders this time, having apparently picked up reinforcements. They were still a mile back, but closing steadily. "They're persistent," Leon shouted over the thunder of hooves. "I'll give them that." "Persistence won't do them much good once we're behind walls." Caleb leaned forward, urging his horse to greater speed. "Ranch was built to withstand Apache raids. It'll hold against hired guns." They reached the ranch with minutes to spare, sliding from their horses and rushing to secure the heavy wooden gates. Caleb led Leon's horse into the stable while she took up position at one of the wall's firing ports, her guns already drawn. The ranch house sat in the center of a walled compound, the walls themselves built from local stone and standing 8 feet high. His father had designed it for defense, with firing ports at regular intervals and a clear field of fire in all directions. The gate was solid oak reinforced with iron bands, capable of withstanding anything short of artillery. "Not bad," Leon said, scanning the defenses with a professional eye. "How much ammunition do you have?" "Enough." Caleb was already moving through the house, gathering rifles and boxes of cartridges. "My father believed in being prepared. We've got 3 rifles, 4 pistols, and enough bullets to hold off most threats." Most threats aren't the Blackwood Syndicate. But Leon was smiling slightly as she checked the rifles he handed her. "Still, this gives us options. If we're smart about it, we might actually survive the night." The riders appeared on the horizon just as the sun touched the western mountains. Caleb counted them through the firing port. 6 now, maybe more behind. They'd regrouped, reinforced, and come prepared for a siege. The leader, the same scarred man from the canyon, now on a fresh horse, rode forward alone, stopping just beyond rifle range. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted across the distance, "Caleb Vance, you don't know what you're protecting. That woman's a thief and a murderer. Hand her over and we'll leave you in peace." Caleb looked at Leon, who was watching the riders with cold calculation. "You a murderer?" "Only when they deserve it." She met his eyes. "And I've never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first." "Good enough." Caleb moved to the firing port and shouted back, "This is my land. You're trespassing. Turn around and ride out, or I'll defend my property." The leader's laugh carried across the desert. "Have it your way, rancher, but when this is over, you'll wish you'd been smart." The riders withdrew to a safer distance, disappearing into the gathering darkness. But Caleb knew they weren't gone. They were out there, watching, waiting, planning their next move. "They'll hit us at night," Leon said, confirming his thoughts. "Probably right before dawn, when we're most likely to be exhausted. They'll try to burn us out or breach the gate. Then we'd better get ready." Caleb began distributing weapons and ammunition to strategic positions around the compound. You ever held a siege before? Once or twice. Leon was checking the house's interior, evaluating sight lines and defensive positions. Usually I was on the attacking side, though. This'll be a new experience. They worked through the evening, preparing the ranch for battle. Caleb filled barrels with water and positioned them around the compound in case of fire. Leon set up fallback positions and cleared potential cover that attackers might use. Together, they transformed the peaceful ranch into a fortress. As night fell completely, they took turns at watch, one sleeping while the other monitored the darkness beyond the walls. Caleb found himself studying this woman who'd crashed into his life like a meteor, bringing fire and violence in her wake. She was nothing like what he'd expected, nothing like the quiet, practical partner he'd imagined building a life with. But as he watched her move through the darkness with confident grace, checking weapons and defenses with professional competence, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect. "Why did you really take Margaret's place?" he asked during one of Leon's watch shifts. "You could have gone anywhere, disappeared into any city. Why come out here?" Leanne was quiet for a long moment, her eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the walls. "Because I was tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder. I thought, oh, maybe if I went somewhere remote enough, somewhere they'd never think to look, I could find some peace. Buy myself time to figure out my next move. And instead you brought the war with you." "Instead, I brought the war with you," she agreed. "I'm sorry for that, truly. You seem like a decent man. You don't deserve this. My father used to say that what we deserve and what we get are two different things." Caleb moved to stand beside her at the firing port, looking out at the same darkness. "But we work with what we're given, and right now, what we're given is a fight worth fighting. Those ledgers could save a lot of innocent people. If we survive to deliver them, then we'd better make sure we survive." They stood there in companionable silence, two strangers bound together by circumstance and imminent violence. Outside, the desert night was alive with sounds. Coyotes calling, wind whistling through the rocks, the distant hoot of an owl. And underneath it all, if you listened carefully, the almost imperceptible sound of men positioning themselves for an attack. "They're moving," Leon whispered. "Northeast corner. At least 2, maybe 3. Caleb strained his ears and heard it. The soft crunch of boots on sand, the muffled clink of metal on metal. "Testing our perimeter, seeing where we're weak. Everywhere's weak if they have enough men and enough time." Leon had her rifle up, sighting along the barrel into the darkness. "But we can make them pay for every inch." A flash of movement near the wall. Leon fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the night for a split second. Someone cursed in the darkness, and the sound of retreating footsteps followed. "One less to worry about," Leon said, already reloading, "at least temporarily." The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. 3 men hit the eastern wall simultaneously, using grappling hooks to scale the stone. Caleb and Leon met them at the top with gunfire, driving them back before they could establish a foothold. But it was a feint. While they were focused on the east, another group hit the gate with a battering ram. The oak held, but Caleb could hear the wood groaning under the assault. Each impact shook the entire wall, sending vibrations through the stone. "They're going to breach," Leon said, her voice tight. "We need to fall back to the house, make them fight for every room." "Not yet." Caleb had grabbed one of the oil lanterns from the house. "My father built one more surprise into this place." He ran to the gate, Leon covering him with rapid fire that kept the attackers' heads down. There, hidden in a recess beside the entrance, was a small iron door set into the stone. Caleb yanked it open, revealing a pile of dry kindling and a narrow channel that ran under the gate to the outside. "What?" Leon started to ask. Caleb smashed the lantern into the kindling, which caught immediately. Fire raced through the channel, following the line of oil his father had built into the gate's foundation. On the other side, Caleb heard screams as flames erupted among the men working the battering ram. The assault broke. Men scattered, some of them on fire, all of them in chaos. Leon took advantage of their confusion, her rifle barking steadily as she dropped anyone who presented a clear target. For a few precious minutes, silence returned to the ranch. Caleb and Leon stood at the wall, breathing hard, smoke stinging their eyes and throats. "That was clever," Leon said. "Your father knew his business. He survived 30 years out here. You don't do that by being unprepared." Caleb reloaded his rifle with shaking hands, adrenaline making his fingers clumsy. But they'll be back, and they'll be angry. Let them be angry. Leon's voice was hard, cold. Angry men make mistakes, and we'll make them pay for everyone. The night stretched on, each hour marked by sporadic gunfire and brief, violent exchanges. The Blackwood men probed the defenses again and again, looking for weaknesses, testing their resolve. Each time, Caleb and Leanne drove them back, but the cost was accumulating. Ammunition spent, exhaustion setting in, small wounds that would become problems if the siege lasted. Around 3 in the morning, during a lull in the fighting, Leanne spoke quietly. "If this goes bad," she said, "if they breach the house and we can't hold them, there's a knife in my boot. Small blade, very sharp. I'd rather use it on myself than let them take me alive." Caleb looked at her, seeing the absolute seriousness in her expression. "It won't come to that. You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I'm choosing to believe it anyway. We've held them this long. We can hold them until dawn. And then what? They'll have reinforcements. We'll still be trapped. Then we'll figure something out. We're not dead yet." He managed a tired smile. "Besides, I didn't survive this long by giving up. Neither did you." Leon studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. We're not dead yet." The horizon was just beginning to show the faintest hint of gray when Caleb heard it. Hoofbeats. Lots of them. Coming fast from the west. "They're bringing in the cavalry," Leon said, her voice flat. "This is it. The final push." But something was wrong. The Blackwood men outside the walls were reacting with confusion rather than triumph. Someone was shouting orders, and the tone was panic rather than aggression. Caleb risked a look over the wall and felt his heart surge with hope. A column of riders was approaching, but they weren't Blackwood men. They wore territorial marshal badges, and at their head rode a man Caleb recognized, Marshal Jack Thornton, an honest lawman in a sea of corrupt officials, one of the few men Blackwood hadn't managed to buy. The siege was over. The Blackwood men scattered like crows from a gunshot, abandoning their positions and racing for their horses with the panicked urgency of men who knew the game had changed. Caleb watched them flee into the pre-dawn shadows. Their leader, the scarred man who'd been so confident just hours before, shouting curses as he wheeled his horse around and spurred it hard toward the eastern hills. Marshal Thornton raised his hand, signaling his deputies to hold their fire. The lawmen fanned out in a loose formation, their rifles trained on the retreating figures, but they didn't pursue. Instead, Thornton dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle and approached the ranch gate on foot. "Caleb Vance," he called out, his voice carrying the distinctive gravel of a lifelong smoker. "You planning to shoot at law enforcement, or can we talk like civilized people?" Caleb felt the tension drain from his shoulders, replaced immediately by a bone-deep exhaustion that made his legs weak. Beside him, Lion had lowered her rifle, but hadn't set it down, her eyes still tracking the fleeing riders with predatory focus. "Gate's compromised," Caleb shouted back. "Give me a minute to get it open." It took longer than a minute. The fire had warped the iron bands and charred the oak, and the battering ram had done structural damage that would require days of work to properly repair. But eventually, Caleb managed to swing the gate open wide enough for Thornton to slip through, leaving his deputies stationed outside. The marshal was a tall man gone to weathered leather, his face creased by years of desert sun and hard decisions. He wore his badge pinned to a vest that had seen better decades, and his gun belt sat low on his hips, with the comfortable familiarity of a man who'd drawn his weapon more times than he could count. When his eyes fell on Leanne, they narrowed with recognition. "Miss Joe," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Been looking for you for quite some time." Leanne straightened, her hand drifting toward her pistol. "Marshal, I can explain." "I'm sure you can." Thornton held up a hand. "But before you start, I need to know. Do you still have them? The Blackwood ledgers?" The question hung in the smoke-tinged air between them. Caleb looked from the marshal to Leanne, trying to read the dynamic, to understand whether they were still in danger or if salvation had truly arrived. Leanne's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Hidden. Safe. Why?" "Because those ledgers are the only chance we've got." Thornton pulled off his hat, and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "You stirred up a hornet's nest when you stole them, girl. Blackwood's been pulling every string they've got, calling in favors from here to San Francisco. Half the marshals in 3 territories have orders to bring you in dead or alive. The other half have orders to kill you on sight and burn whatever you're carrying." "But not you," Caleb said. "Not me." Thornton's smile was grim. "See, I'm one of the few lawmen they haven't managed to buy yet. Been waiting years for something like this. Real evidence, documented proof of what they've been doing. When I heard Miss Joe had made off with their account books, I started heading this direction on a hunch. Figured she'd head for somewhere remote, somewhere she could disappear." "How did you find us?" Leanne asked, suspicion still coloring her voice. "I didn't. Not exactly. I was tracking the Blackwood men. They're not subtle when they move in force. Followed them to Copper Ridge, watched them chase someone out of town, and put 2 and 2 together." He gestured at the damage around them, the bullet-scarred walls and scorched gate. "Looks like I got here just in time." "Just in time would have been 6 hours ago," Caleb muttered, thinking of the long night, the constant fear, the narrow escapes. "Fair point." Thornton had the grace to look apologetic. "We rode hard as we could once I realized what was happening, but the fact remains you're alive, the ledgers are safe, and Blackwood's men are on the run. That's better than it could have been." Leanne lowered her rifle completely, though she didn't relax her stance. "What happens now?" "Now we get those ledgers somewhere safe. Somewhere I can study them properly and build cases against every name in those books. The territorial court in Santa Fe has a judge who's clean, Judge Morrison. If we can get the evidence to him, we can start bringing these bastards down." Thornton's eyes were hard as flint. "But it's a 3-day ride to Santa Fe, and Blackwood will have men watching every route. They'll throw everything they've got at stopping us." "Then we don't take the routes they're watching," Leanne said. "There are back trails, canyon passages that most people don't know about. Harder travel, but harder to ambush." "You know these trails?" "Some. And I'm a fast learner for the ones I don't." Leanne glanced at Caleb. "But I'll need a guide, someone who knows this territory." Caleb felt the weight of their expectations settle on his shoulders. His ranch was damaged, his life upended, and every survival instinct he possessed was screaming at him to stay here, rebuild, return to the simple existence he'd known before a woman in black stepped off a train and brought war to his doorstep. But he thought about his father, about the lessons the old man had tried to teach him about standing up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. He thought about all the families Blackwood had destroyed, all the lives they'd ruined in their pursuit of profit and power. And he thought about Leanne, who could have run in 1,000 different directions but had chosen to fight instead. "I know the trails," he said quietly. "I can get us to Santa Fe. But we'll need supplies, fresh horses. My stock's been run ragged." "We brought spare mounts," Thornton said, "and we can resupply at—" A gunshot cracked across the desert, the bullet spanging off the stone wall inches from the marshal's head. Everyone dove for cover as more shots followed, a rolling barrage that sent chips of stone flying through the air. "They're back!" one of Thornton's deputies shouted from outside the gate. "East Ridge, at least a dozen rifles." Caleb scrambled to a firing port and swore. The fleeing Blackwood men hadn't fled at all. They'd regrouped on the high ground overlooking the ranch, and now they were dug in with a commanding view of the entire compound. Even as he watched, more riders appeared, reinforcements arriving to turn retreat into siege. "They're not going to let us just ride out," Leanne said, her voice tight. "They'll pin us here until more men arrive, then overwhelm us with numbers." Thornton was already shouting orders to his deputies, directing them to take cover and return fire. But even with the lawmen added to their numbers, they were badly outgunned. The Blackwood men had the high ground, plenty of ammunition, and the patience to wait them out. "We need to break the siege," Caleb said, his mind racing through possibilities. "Force them off that ridge before they can get properly entrenched." "How?" Thornton demanded. "We charge up there, we'll be cut to pieces." "Not if they're too busy trying to save their own skins." Caleb was already moving toward the stable, an idea forming. "Those arroyos that run behind the ranch, they connect to the canyon system. A small group could work their way around, come up behind their position." "That's suicide," one of the deputies protested. "They'll see you coming a mile away." "Not if they're distracted." Leanne had followed Caleb to the stable, understanding dawning in her eyes. Someone stays here, keeps them focused on the ranch. The rest of us circle around and hit them from behind. I'll stay, Thornton said immediately. My men and I can keep them occupied. You three take the back route. 3? Caleb looked at him questioningly. You, Miss Joe, and my best tracker, Deputy Sam Cortez. You'll need someone who knows how to move quiet. Thornton was already waving over a lean, dark-haired man who moved with the fluid grace of someone more at home in the wilderness than in towns. Sam, you're with them. Follow Vance's lead, watch their backs, and try not to get killed. Cortez nodded, his face unreadable. Yes, sir. They gathered weapons and what little ammunition they could spare, moving quickly while Thornton's remaining deputies kept up a steady rate of fire to convince the Blackwood men that everyone was still pinned in the ranch. Caleb selected his best rifle, a Winchester his father had maintained with religious devotion, and filled his pockets with cartridges. Leanne checked her pistols one more time, her movements automatic, efficient. How long until we're in position? 2 hours if we move fast. Maybe 3 if the terrain's worse than I remember. Caleb led them to the back of the stable where a narrow gate opened onto a dry wash that couldn't be seen from the ridge. Once we're behind them, we'll have maybe one chance to break their position. They'll scatter or they'll rally, and we better hope for scattering. They'll scatter, Leanne said with quiet certainty. They're hired guns, not soldiers. When the shooting starts from an unexpected direction, they'll run. They slipped out through the back gate one at a time, using the stable and outbuildings to mask their departure. The wash was narrow and choked with sage and creosote, but it provided cover from observation as they worked their way south, parallel to the ranch perimeter. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued. Thornton's men keeping up the charade, burning through precious ammunition to sell the deception. Every shot made Caleb wince, knowing that every bullet spent now was one they wouldn't have for the real fight. Deputy Cortez took point, moving through the brush with barely a sound, occasionally stopping to listen for signs of sentries or scouts. Caleb followed, then Leanne, the 3 of them forming a silent file that snaked through the desert landscape. The wash emptied into a wider arroyo that Caleb recognized, part of the same canyon system where they'd made their first stand against the Blackwood Riders. The walls rose around them, blocking out the early morning sun and turning the air cool and still. This way, Caleb whispered, pointing toward a narrow side passage that would take them up and around the ridge. It's steep, but it'll put us above them. They climbed in silence, hands and feet finding purchase on sun-baked rock that had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and rare rain. The passage twisted upward like a snake, sometimes so narrow they had to turn sideways, sometimes opening into small chambers where ancient floods had carved hollows in the stone. Halfway up, Cortez froze, one hand raised in warning. Caleb stopped immediately, straining his ears. At first he heard nothing but his own heartbeat and the distant crack of rifles from the ranch. Then, faintly, voices drifting down from above. Told you they ain't going nowhere. Thornton's pinned just like the rest of them. Boss said to watch for tricks. That Joe woman's slippery. She's trapped in a stone box with nowhere to run. Ain't no tricks getting her out of this. Laughter, rough and confident. The sound of men who thought they'd already won. Leanne's hand moved to her pistol, but Cortez shook his head minutely. Not yet. They were still too far below, the angles all wrong. Move too soon, and they'd lose their advantage. They continued climbing, each step careful and deliberate, until the passage opened onto a flat shelf of rock that overlooked the Blackwood position. Caleb peered over the edge and felt his stomach tighten. There were more of them than he'd thought. At least 20 men spread across the ridge, most with rifles trained on the ranch below. They'd built crude breastworks from piled stones, and had clearly settled in for a long siege. At the center of the position, the scarred leader from before was directing fire, his long coat discarded in the growing heat. We can't take all of them, Cortez breathed. Even with surprise, those odds are suicide. We don't have to take them all, Leanne said, her eyes scanning the position with tactical precision. We just have to break their cohesion. See that ammunition stockpile? The crates next to their leader? Caleb saw it. Several wooden boxes stacked carelessly near the command position, close enough to the firing line that a good shot could. You're thinking of blowing their ammunition, he said. I'm thinking of giving them a reason to run. Leon was already unslinging her rifle. Cortez, you and Caleb target the men on the flanks once the confusion starts. I'll take the center shot. That's a hell of a long shot, Cortez said doubtfully. 300 yards at least, downward angle, wind from the east. I've made harder. Leon settled into position, bracing her rifle against a rock outcropping. She took her time, adjusting for wind and distance, her breathing slow and controlled. When I fire, you fire, everything you've got, fast as you can. Make them think there's a whole company up here. Caleb found his own position, sighting down on a cluster of men at the northern edge of the Blackwood line. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering. This was the moment. Succeed, and they broke the siege. Failed, and they'd be trapped between enemies with nowhere to run. Leon's rifle spoke first, the crack echoing off canyon walls and making it sound like multiple shots. Caleb saw the bullet strike true, punching through the wooden crate and into the ammunition inside. For one frozen second, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The ammunition detonated in a rolling blast that sent fire and shrapnel tearing through the Blackwood position. Men were thrown like dolls, their screams lost in the thunder of cascading explosions as one crate set off another. The scarred leader disappeared in the first blast, his long coat flaring briefly before the flames consumed everything. Caleb fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Beside him, Cortez was doing the same, their rifles creating a withering crossfire that caught the survivors in a deadly envelope. Men scrambled for cover that didn't exist, some diving over the ridge's edge in their panic, others simply running with no thought to direction or safety. Leon had switched to her pistols, standing fully exposed on the shelf as she systematically targeted anyone trying to organize a response. Her face was set in hard lines, no triumph or satisfaction, just cold focus as she dismantled what remained of their command structure. In less than 2 minutes, it was over. The ridge was littered with bodies and abandoned weapons. The few survivors were fleeing in all directions, their horses forgotten in their panic. Below, Caleb could hear Thornton's men cheering as they realized the siege was broken. "We need to move," Cortez said, already heading back down the passage. "More will come. Blackwood's got deep pockets and deeper networks." They descended quickly, no longer worried about silence. By the time they reached the ranch, Thornton had his men collecting abandoned weapons and seeing to the wounded. 2 deputies had taken minor injuries, but nothing life-threatening. The Blackwood casualties were far worse. The marshal's face was grim as he surveyed the damage. "How many?" Caleb asked. 12 dead, maybe more in the canyon when they ran. Another 8 wounded badly enough they won't be riding anywhere. Thornton looked at Leon with something between respect and unease. "That was some shooting, Miss Joe. Where'd you learn to fight like that?" "Places I'd rather forget," Leon said shortly. She was reloading her weapons with mechanical precision, her hands never stopping even as she spoke. "But it doesn't matter where I learned. What matters is getting those ledgers to Santa Fe before Blackwood sends another wave." "She's right," Caleb said. "We hurt them bad here, but they've got resources we can't match. Every hour we wait gives them time to regroup." Thornton nodded slowly. "Then we ride within the hour. Cortez, divide the spare horses. Vance, you'll need to pack light, just weapons, water, and enough food for 4 days hard riding." 4 days? Leon frowned. "You said Santa Fe was 3 days." 3 days on the main routes, but we're not taking main routes. The marshal pulled out a worn map, spreading it across a bullet-scarred table. "We're going through the Sangre de Cristo range. It's rough country, trails that'll tear up horses and test riders, but it's territory Blackwood won't expect. Most of their men are city boys and hired guns. They won't have the skill or stomach for true wilderness." Caleb studied the map, recognizing some of the landmarks, but not all. The route Thornton was proposing would take them through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the territory. Narrow mountain passes, high-altitude crossings, stretches where one wrong step could send horse and rider tumbling into oblivion. "It's dangerous," he said. "Everything's dangerous now," Thornton replied. "Question is which kind of danger you'd rather face. Blackwood ambushes on easy terrain or harsh land with fewer enemies." "The land I can handle," Leon said. "The land doesn't think, doesn't plan, doesn't hire more guns when the first wave fails. I'll take mountains over murderers any day." They spent the next hour in frantic preparation. Caleb gathered what supplies he could from the ranch, though there wasn't much. The siege had depleted his stores, and what remained had to be divided among more people than he'd planned for. Thornton's deputies contributed what they could spare, but it still felt inadequate for a 4-day mountain crossing. As Caleb was securing his bedroll to a borrowed horse, Leanne approached him. Her expression was softer than he'd seen before, some of the hard edges worn down by exhaustion and proximity to death. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not turning me away, for fighting beside me. You didn't have to do any of this." "Yeah, I did." Caleb checked the saddle girth, not quite meeting her eyes. "Maybe not for you specifically, but for what you're carrying, for what it represents. My father used to say that evil thrives when good men do nothing. I've done nothing for too long." "You built a life. That's not nothing." "Built a life and ignored everything beyond my property lines." He finally looked at her, seeing the woman beneath the warrior. "Maybe it took someone like you crashing into my world to remind me that there's more to existence than just survival." Leanne was quiet for a moment, then reached into her jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound book, one of the Blackwood ledgers. She held it carefully, almost reverently. "I've been running with these for 3 months. 3 months of looking over my shoulder, sleeping with one eye open, never trusting anyone. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside me instead of behind me. How many ledgers are there?" 3 total. I've got them sewn into my jacket lining, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against water damage." She gestured to the worn leather she always wore. "They're why I couldn't travel light, couldn't just disappear into some city and start over. These books are evidence, proof, justice for hundreds of families. They're worth more than my life." "They're not worth more than your life," Caleb said firmly. "Evidence is just paper and ink. You're the one who stole them, who's fighting to get them to people who can use them. Without you, they're just books." "Mount up," Thornton's voice cut across the compound. "We're losing daylight." The group that rode out from Caleb's ranch was a strange mix. 3 lawmen, 1 rancher, and a fugitive carrying the most dangerous documents in 3 territories. They headed north initially, making it look like they were heading for the main road to Santa Fe, then cut east as soon as they were out of sight of any watchers. The terrain changed quickly as they left the desert behind and climbed into the foothills. Sage and creosote gave way to pine and juniper, the air growing cooler and thinner with each mile gained. By midday, they were following trails that barely deserved the name, animal tracks and game paths that wound between rock formations and skirted the edges of steep drops. Cortez rode point, his eyes constantly scanning for danger, both human and natural. Behind him came Thornton and his other deputy, a quiet man named Hayes, who'd barely spoken 10 words since the siege ended. Caleb and Leanne brought up the rear, their horses picking their way carefully over loose stone and exposed roots. "You ever been through these mountains?" Leanne asked as they navigated a particularly treacherous switchback. "Once, when I was young. My father brought me up here to teach me how to read the land, how to find water and shelter when you're far from civilization." Caleb remembered it vividly. Weeks in the wilderness with just his father and the horses, learning lessons that had kept him alive through years of frontier living. He said that men who only know cities and towns are only half-educated. The land teaches lessons that no school can. "My father said something similar." Leanne's voice carried a note of old pain. "He was a scholar, but he believed that knowledge without understanding was worthless. He taught me to see connections, to understand systems and how they could be exploited or protected." "Is he still No. He died when I was 16. Blackwood's men, though I didn't know it at the time, they wanted land he owned and he wouldn't sell. They called it an accident, but I knew better." Her hands tightened on the reins. "That's when I started learning other skills, shooting, fighting, surviving. Couldn't bring him back, but I could make sure I'd never be helpless again." They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the trail climbed higher into the mountains. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent, painting the peaks in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, Caleb could see storm clouds gathering, their dark bellies promising rain or possibly snow at the higher elevations. Around mid-afternoon, Cortez raised his hand in a silent signal, bringing the column to a halt. Everyone froze, hands moving to weapons as the deputy dismounted and crouched to examine something on the trail. "Tracks," he said quietly. "Fresh. Maybe an hour old. 3 riders, heading the same direction we are. Blackwood? Thornton asked. Can't tell for sure, but the timing's suspicious. Could be coincidence, could be scouts. Cortez stood, his eyes following the trail ahead. Either way, we should assume we're not alone up here. They proceeded with increased caution, spreading out to make themselves harder targets, avoiding skylines where they might be silhouetted against the clouds. The trail narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer wall rising on one side and empty space dropping away on the other. Caleb's horse balked at the crossing, sensing the danger. He had to coax it forward with gentle words and steady hands, feeling every muscle in his body tense as the animal's hooves clicked against stone that could give way at any moment. One slip, one moment of panic, and they'd both tumble into the abyss. Halfway across, Leon's voice came from behind him. "Don't look down. Keep your eyes on the far side." "Wasn't planning on it," Caleb muttered, but he appreciated the distraction. "How are you so calm?" "I'm not calm, I'm terrified. But terror doesn't help, so I ignore it and focus on what needs to be done." A pause. "Also, I've been in worse spots than this. Worse than crossing a mountain ledge with killers potentially ahead and definitely behind? I once had to climb out of a burning building while people shot at me. This is practically a Sunday ride in comparison." Despite the situation, Caleb felt a smile tug at his lips. Leon's dark humor was growing on him, her refusal to be intimidated by circumstances that would break most people. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, harder than the frontier women who'd been weathered by years of struggle, yet somehow more alive, more present in each moment. They made the crossing without incident and stopped to rest the horses in a small clearing surrounded by pines. Thornton consulted his map again, his finger tracing routes that wound deeper into the mountains. "We're making good time, he said. "If we keep this pace, we'll be through the high passes by tomorrow evening. Then it's downhill to Santa Fe." "Assuming the weather holds," Hayes said, the first words Caleb had heard from him. He was looking at the storm clouds, which had grown darker and closer. Rain in these mountains can turn trails into rivers. Snow can close passes completely. "Then we'd better not waste daylight standing around talking about it." Thornton folded his map and remounted. "Cortez, stay sharp. If there are scouts ahead, I want to know before they know we're here." They pushed on as the afternoon wore into evening, the temperature dropping noticeably as they climbed higher. The pines gave way to aspens whose leaves shimmered like gold coins in the fading light, and the trail became steeper, forcing the horses to pick their way carefully over exposed roots and rocky outcroppings. Just before sunset, as they crested a ridge that offered a view back the way they'd come, Cortez pulled up short and swore. "What is it?" Thornton demanded. The deputy pointed. Far below, barely visible in the gathering darkness, a column of riders was following their trail. Caleb counted quickly. At least 15, maybe 20. Too many to fight, too determined to outrun. "Blackwood?" Leon said, no question in her voice. "They must have been waiting at the ranch, watching for us to leave." "They're hours behind," Thornton said, but there was tension in his voice. "We can maintain that distance if we keep moving. Until we hit terrain that slows us down, or need to rest the horses, or run into those scouts ahead." Caleb felt the trap closing around them. "They'll push hard knowing they have us boxed. It's what I'd do." "Then we need to change the game." Leon was studying the terrain with that same tactical assessment she'd used at the ranch. "Make them think we're still ahead when we're actually behind. Set an ambush they won't see coming." "Ambitious," Thornton said dryly. "How do you propose we accomplish that particular miracle?" "The trail splits ahead, doesn't it?" Leon looked at Caleb. "I saw it on your map. One route goes high through the passes, the other loops around through the valleys." Caleb nodded slowly, seeing where she was going. "The high route is faster but more exposed. The valley route takes longer but has more cover. So we make it look like we took the high route, leave obvious tracks, maybe even send one rider ahead to lay a false trail. While they're chasing shadows through the passes, we take the valley route and come around behind them." "That's insane," Hayes said flatly. "We'd be doubling back toward danger instead of running from it." "Exactly, which is why they won't expect it." Leon looked at each of them in turn. "We can't outrun them forever. Eventually they'll catch us, probably in terrain where we have no advantages. This way, we choose the ground, we choose the timing, and we cut their numbers before the real pursuit begins." Thornton was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all carried tremendous risk. Finally, he nodded. "Cortez, you're our best tracker. Think you can lay a trail convincing enough to fool professional hunters?" "I can try." The deputy didn't sound entirely confident, but he was already studying the split trail ahead. "I'll need one of the spare horses to make it look like the whole group went that way." "Take mine," Hayes said. "I'll ride double with the marshal." They worked quickly as darkness fell, Cortez carefully placing tracks and disturbing vegetation to make it appear that the entire group had taken the high route. He even went so far as to build a small campfire at a likely stopping point, then carefully concealed it so it would look like someone had tried to hide evidence of their passage. While he worked, the rest of them headed down into the valley, moving as quietly as possible through terrain that seemed determined to betray them with every snapping twig and rolling stone. The valley floor was thick with undergrowth, and navigation by moonlight was treacherous at best, suicidal at worst. But they pushed through, driven by the knowledge that behind them, Blackwood's hunters were closing the distance with every passing hour. They spent that first night huddled in a narrow ravine where the valley walls provided some shelter from the wind that howled through the higher elevations. No fire, no hot food, just cold jerky and water that tasted of melted snow. Caleb took first watch, his rifle across his knees as he stared out into darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. Leon sat beside him despite not being on watch rotation, her back against the cold stone, her eyes reflecting what little starlight filtered through the clouds above. "You think Cortez made it?" she asked quietly. "He's good at what he does. If anyone can lay a false trail and slip away clean, it's him." Caleb shifted position, trying to find comfort where none existed. "Question is whether Blackwood's men are good enough to see through it." "They don't have to see through it. They just have to follow it long enough for us to get ahead." She pulled her jacket tighter, though the cold didn't seem to bother her as much as it should. By the time they realize they've been duped, we'll have cut their numbers and taken their horses. Even the odds considerably. That's assuming the ambush works, assuming they take the bait, assuming we don't get ourselves killed in the process. Caleb looked at her in the darkness. "You always this optimistic about plans that could get everyone killed?" "Optimism has nothing to do with it. It's mathematics, probability, the calculated assessment of risk versus reward." But there was a ghost of humor in her voice. "Though I'll admit the probabilities aren't great. Maybe 60% chance of success, 40% chance we all die horribly. Those are terrible odds. They're better than the odds of running until our horses collapse and Blackwood's men ride us down an open country. That's maybe a 10% survival rate, and that's being generous." She was quiet for a moment. "I've spent 3 months running from these people, Caleb. I know how they think, how they operate. They're relentless, but they're also predictable. They expect fear, expect their targets to behave like prey. When prey acts like predator, it throws them off balance." "And you've done this before? Turned the tables like this?" "Twice. Once in Sacramento when they cornered me in a warehouse district. I was supposed to hide, supposed to try sneaking past them. Instead, I set the warehouse on fire and picked them off as they tried to escape the flames. The second time was in the desert outside Tucson. They thought they had me trapped in a box canyon, but I knew that canyon had a back way out. Led them in, then circled around and stole their horses while they were searching for me." Caleb shook his head, somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the craziest." "Probably both. Bravery and insanity look pretty similar when you're in the middle of it." She pulled one of her pistols and began checking it in that automatic way she had, her hands knowing the weapon so well they didn't need eyes to guide them. "What about you? What made a rancher decide to throw in with a fugitive and take on the Blackwood Syndicate?" "Told you already. My father's lessons about standing up to evil." "That's what you said. But there's more to it than that. I've met plenty of men who heard lessons about right and wrong, then ignored them the moment it became inconvenient." She tilted her head, studying him. "You could have turned me away at the depot. Could have let those riders take me. Could have told Marshal Thornton you wanted no part of this and gone back to your ranch. But you didn't. Why?" Caleb was quiet, searching for words to explain something he wasn't entirely sure he understood himself. I spent 10 years building that ranch. 10 years focusing on nothing but survival, profit, making sure I had enough to weather the next drought or harsh winter. And somewhere in all that focus, I stopped seeing people, stopped caring about anything beyond my property lines. When you stepped off that train, when those riders came after you, it was like waking up from a long sleep. Suddenly there was something worth fighting for again, something bigger than just my own survival. The ledgers. The ledgers, sure, but also you. He met her eyes. You didn't have to steal that evidence. Could have just run when you figured out who you were working for. But you chose to fight, to risk everything to stop them. That kind of courage deserves support, not abandonment. Leon was quiet for a long time, her expression unreadable in the darkness. Finally she said, I'm not who you think I am, Caleb. I'm not some noble crusader fighting for justice. I stole those ledgers out of anger, out of a desire for revenge. When I saw my father's name in their records, saw the notation next to it, eliminated, 0 complications. I didn't think about evidence or courts or bringing them to justice through proper channels. I thought about burning their entire organization to the ground and salting the earth where it stood. But you didn't. No, because somewhere between stealing the ledgers and running for my life, I started actually reading them, started seeing all the other names, all the other families destroyed, and I realized that my revenge was smaller than the justice those people deserved. She holstered her pistol. So yes, I'm fighting now, but I'm fighting because I have to, not because I'm brave. Big difference. I don't think there is a difference, Caleb said. Bravery isn't not being afraid. It's being afraid and fighting anyway. Before Lion could respond, a low whistle echoed through the ravine. Thornton signaled that someone was approaching. Everyone came alert instantly, weapons drawn, eyes straining against the darkness to identify friend or foe. A figure materialized from the shadows, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the wilderness. Cortez returned from laying the false trail, his clothes torn in places and a shallow cut on his cheek that spoke of hard travel through unforgiving terrain. It's done, he said quietly, accepting water from Hayes. Left a trail a blind man could follow, with enough mistakes to make it look like we were trying to hide our passage, but not quite succeeding. If they're tracking us, they'll take the bait. If? Thornton pressed. I doubled back far enough to see. They're following, all right, pushed their horses hard through the night to close the distance. I'd say they're maybe 3 hours behind our false trail now. Cortez's expression was grim. But there's something else. The group split. Most of them went after the high trail like we hoped, but I counted at least 5 riders who kept to the main valley route. They're not following our tracks. They're casting wide, making sure we didn't do exactly what we did. Smart, Leon muttered. Their leader's learning from his mistakes. How far behind are these valley riders? Hard to say. I had to move fast to avoid them. Couldn't risk getting close enough for accurate assessment, but if I had to guess, maybe 6 hours behind us. We've got distance, but it's shrinking. Thornton studied his map by the faint light of the stars, his finger tracing routes and calculating distances. The valley narrows ahead, funnels into a gorge where the river cuts through the mountains. If we're going to ambush the valley riders, that's the place to do it. But we'd need to get there first, set up before they arrive. How far? Caleb asked. 4 hours hard riding, maybe 5 if the terrain's worse than the map shows. And it's always worse than the map shows. They mounted up immediately, exhaustion forgotten in the urgency of the situation. The valley floor was treacherous in the darkness. Hidden roots reached up to trip the horses, rocks shifted under their hooves, and low-hanging branches seemed to materialize from nowhere to catch unwary riders. But they pushed through, driven by the knowledge that behind them, skilled hunters were closing the gap with every passing hour. Dawn found them approaching the gorge Thornton had described, a narrow slash in the mountains where a river had carved its way through solid stone over countless centuries. The walls rose 100 feet on either side, close enough in places that a good shot could cover the entire passage. The river itself was running high with snowmelt, its roar echoing off the canyon walls and creating a constant thunder that would mask the sound of movement. "This is it," Leon said, her eyes already calculating angles and positions. "We set up on both sides, create a crossfire they can't escape. When they enter the gorge, we close the trap. 5 of us against 5 of them, Hayes said. Even odds. Better than even. We have position, surprise, and preparation. They'll be focused on tracking, not on defense. Leon was already dismounting, leading her horse toward a position on the north wall. Caleb, you take the south side with Cortez. Marshall, you and Hayes position yourselves at the far end. If any of them break through the initial ambush, you're the last line. I'll take the entrance, make sure none of them escape back the way they came. They moved quickly, each person finding positions among the rocks and sparse vegetation that clung to the gorge walls. Caleb wedged himself into a narrow crevice that provided cover while still offering a clear field of fire across the gorge floor. Beside him, Cortez settled into a similar position, his rifle already shouldered and sighted. "You ever shoot a man?" the deputy asked quietly. "Yes." Caleb's voice was flat. "Apache raiders when I was younger, claim jumpers a few years back, and more than I care to count at my ranch yesterday. You?" "Too many times. Never gets easier despite what some folks think." Cortez adjusted his position slightly. "Just wanted to make sure you were steady. This kind of shooting, it's different from defending your home. This is deliberate, calculated killing." "I know what it is." Caleb checked his rifle one more time, making sure the action was smooth and the sights were clear. "And I know why we're doing it. These men chose to work for Blackwood, chose to hunt an innocent woman for money. They've made their choices. Just wanted to hear you say it." They waited as the sun climbed higher, burning off the night's chill and turning the gorge into a furnace of reflected heat. The river's constant roar became almost hypnotic, and Caleb had to force himself to stay alert, to keep scanning the approaches for any sign of their pursuers. It was nearly noon when Cortez's hand signal indicated movement. Caleb's eyes locked onto the gorge entrance and saw them, 5 riders approaching cautiously, their eyes on the ground as they followed tracks that weren't there. They were professionals. He could see that in the way they moved, the way they checked their surroundings, the way their hands never strayed far from their weapons. But they were also tired, pushed hard by their pursuit, and that exhaustion had dulled their edge just enough to make them vulnerable. The riders entered the gorge in single file, the narrow passage forcing them into a formation that eliminated their numerical advantage. The lead rider was a tall man with a scarred face that might have been handsome once, his eyes constantly moving as he searched for signs of their quarry. Behind him came a younger man, barely out of his teens, wearing expensive riding clothes that marked him as someone's son trying to prove himself. The other 3 were cut from similar cloth, professional hunters and guns for hire, men whose loyalty extended exactly as far as Blackwood's money. They were halfway through the gorge when Lion fired. Her first shot took the lead rider in the shoulder, spinning him in the saddle and causing his horse to rear in panic. Before the echo faded, Caleb and Cortez opened up from the south wall, their bullets catching the younger man and dropping him from his mount before he could even draw his weapon. The gorge exploded into chaos. The remaining riders scattered, some diving from their horses to take cover among the rocks, others trying to spur their mounts forward toward the exit. But Thornton and Hayes were waiting, their rifles speaking with methodical precision as they covered the escape route. Caleb fired again, his bullet sparking off a rock inches from a man's head. The hunter returned fire, his shot coming close enough that Caleb felt the bullet's passage like a hot breath against his cheek. He dropped lower, worked the bolt, rose and fired in one smooth motion that his father had drilled into him years ago. This shot found its target, catching the hunter in the chest and sending him sprawling across the wet rocks. Beside him, Cortez was working his rifle like a machine, each shot placed with careful precision. Another Blackwood man went down, then another. The survivors were trapped in a kill box with nowhere to hide and no way out, their expensive training and experience meaningless against prepared defenders with superior position. It was over in less than 3 minutes. 5 riders had entered the gorge. None emerged, their horses scattered in panic, some fleeing back the way they'd come, others splashing through the river in mindless terror. The bodies lay where they'd fallen, testament to the brutal efficiency of a well-planned ambush. Caleb descended from his position on shaking legs, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the fight now fading and leaving him hollow. He'd killed before, but never like this. Never with such cold calculation, never from ambush, never with such overwhelming advantage. It felt less like a fight and more like an execution. Lion was already moving among the fallen, checking for survivors and collecting weapons. Her face was impassive, showing neither triumph nor regret, just the practical focus of someone doing necessary work. When she found the young man still breathing despite his wounds, she knelt beside him. "Who sent you?" she asked. "Just Blackwood's standing forces, or did they bring in outside help?" The young man coughed, blood flecking his lips. "You're dead, all of you. Mr. Blackwood, he's in Santa Fe already, waiting. You think you're riding to safety, but you're riding to him." "How many men does he have?" "Enough." The young man's eyes were defiant despite his pain. "Enough to kill you all and burn those ledgers and make sure nobody ever knows what happened here." Leon stood, her expression troubled. She looked at Thornton, who'd approached during the interrogation. "If Blackwood's in Santa Fe with serious numbers, we're not riding to a court of law. We're riding into another siege." "Judge Morrison has his own security," Thornton said, but he didn't sound convinced. "And the law is on our side. The law is bought and paid for in most places. What makes you think Santa Fe is different?" Leon's frustration was showing through her usual control. "We need a different plan. Somewhere Blackwood can't anticipate, somewhere he doesn't have people positioned." "There's nowhere like that," Hayes said quietly. "Blackwood's reach extends across 3 territories. He's got people in every major town, contacts in every marshal's office. Even some of the federal judges are on his payroll." Caleb had been thinking while they talked, an idea forming that was probably insane but might be their only chance. "What if we don't go to Santa Fe at all? What if we take the ledgers directly to the newspapers?" Everyone turned to look at him. Thornton's expression was skeptical. "Newspapers can't prosecute crimes." "No, but they can publish evidence. Make it public before Blackwood can suppress it." Caleb was gaining confidence in the idea as he spoke. "There's a paper in Denver, the Rocky Mountain News. They've got a reputation for printing stories the powerful don't want printed. If we can get the ledgers to them, they could publish excerpts. Once the information is public, Blackwood can't make it disappear by killing us or burning the evidence." "Denver's 6 days from here," Cortez said. "Maybe 5 if we kill our horses getting there. And you can bet Blackwood's got people watching that route too." "Probably. But he's concentrating his forces in Santa Fe, expecting us to head for the territorial court. Denver would catch him by surprise." Caleb looked at each of them. "It's a long shot, but so is everything we've done up to now." Leon was studying him with new intensity, her sharp mind clearly working through the implications. The newspapers would want proof before publishing something this explosive. We'd need to let them verify the ledgers, which means trusting them with the evidence for at least a day or 2. "You got a better idea?" "No." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. "Actually, I think it's brilliant. Blackwood's whole strategy depends on controlling information, buying silence, keeping his operations in the shadows. Dragging everything into the light destroys his power more effectively than any court case." Thornton was slower to warm to the idea, his lawman's instincts clearly warring with the practical realities of their situation. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we try for Denver, but we'll need to move fast. By now, the main group following the high trail will have realized they've been duped. They'll backtrack, try to find our real trail. We've bought ourselves maybe 12 hours, maybe less." They gathered what supplies they could from the fallen riders: ammunition, food, fresh water. The young man had died during their discussion, his defiant eyes now fixed and empty. They left the bodies where they'd fallen, knowing that scavengers and weather would erase the evidence of this fight long before anyone came looking. The route to Denver took them deeper into the mountains, following trails that probably hadn't seen human travelers in years. The terrain was punishing, steep climbs that left the horses lathered and blowing, narrow passages where one wrong step meant death, and stretches of high altitude that left everyone lightheaded and struggling for breath. But they pushed on, taking turns at point and rear guard, never resting for more than a few hours at a time. The horses began to suffer, their ribs showing through their hides, their steps growing unsteady. Twice they had to stop to tend injuries, once when Thornton's mount came up lame, forcing him to switch to one of the captured horses, and again when Hayes took a bad fall that left him bruised and limping, but fortunately not seriously hurt. On the 3rd day, they descended from the high peaks into rolling foothills covered in pine and aspen. The air grew warmer, thicker, easier to breathe. They could see Denver in the distance, a sprawl of buildings that represented civilization, safety, and the chance to finally stop running. But they also saw the riders. There were at least 30 of them, positioned along the main approaches to Denver, clearly watching for anyone matching their description. Blackwood had anticipated the possibility they might try for the newspapers, and he'd covered his bases accordingly. "We can't fight through that many," Cortez said, stating the obvious. "Even if we could, we'd bring the law down on ourselves. Can't exactly ride into town after a gunfight and claim we're the good guys." "Then we don't fight," Leon said. "We sneak, wait for dark, split up, approach from different directions. They can't watch everything at once." "They don't have to watch everything, they just have to watch the newspaper office." Thornton's voice was heavy with the weight of accumulated exhaustion and setbacks. "And you can bet that's exactly what they're doing." Caleb stared at the distant city, so close and yet impossibly far. They'd come hundreds of miles, survived ambushes and sieges and mountain crossings that would have killed less determined people. And now, with their goal in sight, they were stymied by sheer numbers. Unless they changed the game one more time. "What if we don't go to the newspaper office?" he said slowly. "What if we bring the newspaper to us?" Leon turned to look at him. "How?" "The telegraph. We send a message to the Rocky Mountain News, tell them we have evidence of major corruption, ask them to send a reporter to meet us at a specific location outside the city, somewhere we can control, somewhere Blackwood won't have covered." "They might not come," Hayes said doubtfully. "Might think it's a hoax or a trap." "Then we make it convincing. Give them enough information to verify we're legitimate." Caleb was already working through the details. "There's a telegraph office in every town. We find one that's not being watched, send the message, then set up our meeting spot and wait." Thornton was nodding slowly. "There's a small mining town about 10 miles south of here, Silverton. It's got a telegraph, and it's remote enough that Blackwood probably hasn't bothered posting watchers. We could send the message from there, then circle back to set up the meeting." They changed course immediately, pushing the exhausted horses toward Silverton as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The town, when they reached it just after dark, was a ramshackle collection of buildings clinging to the side of a mountain, supporting a played-out silver mine that still employed maybe 24 desperate men. The telegraph office was little more than a shack attached to the general store, run by an old man who looked half asleep when they burst in. But his eyes sharpened when Thornton showed his badge and explained what they needed. "Don't get much federal business up here," the operator said, his fingers already moving toward the telegraph key. "What's the message?" Leon dictated it carefully, each word chosen for maximum impact. "Evidence of systematic corruption by Blackwood Syndicate. Account ledgers documenting bribes, murder, land theft across 3 territories. Reporter to meet at abandoned Cameron Ranch, 15 miles northeast of Denver, tomorrow dawn. Come alone. Bring verification credentials." The operator tapped it out in efficient Morse, waited for acknowledgement from the Denver station, then nodded. "Sent and received. They'll deliver it within the hour." "Good." Thornton laid coins on the counter. "Now forget you ever saw us." "See who?" the old man said with a gap-toothed grin. They rode through the night toward the Cameron Ranch, a place Caleb knew by reputation. Once a prosperous cattle operation, now abandoned after its owner had died without heirs. The buildings would be in poor condition, but they'd provide shelter and, more importantly, a defensible position if things went wrong. The ranch appeared out of the darkness like a ghost of better days, its buildings sagging and weathered but still standing. They secured the horses in what remained of the stable, then set about preparing the main house for either negotiation or battle, depending on how the morning went. Leon stood watch at one of the broken windows, her eyes scanning the darkness for threats that might or might not be coming. Caleb joined her, too wired to sleep despite his exhaustion. "You think they'll come?" he asked. "The newspaper?" "If they're worth anything as journalists, they'll come. A story this big, with evidence to back it up? That's the kind of thing that builds careers and sells papers." She glanced at him. "Question is whether they'll come alone or whether they'll bring Blackwood's people with them." "You think someone at the newspaper might be compromised?" "I think Blackwood has money and influence and 3 months' head start on covering his tracks. Would be foolish to assume he hasn't tried to buy reporters the same way he's bought marshals and judges." She was quiet for a moment. "But we're out of options. This is our last play." Either it works or we're back to running, and I'm getting tired of running. What will you do? Caleb asked. After this is over, assuming we survive, where will you go? Leanne was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, I don't know. For 3 months, all I've thought about is survival, staying ahead of Blackwood's hunters, getting the ledgers to someone who could use them. I haven't let myself think beyond that because thinking beyond survival felt like tempting fate. But if you could go anywhere, do anything, I used to dream about a quiet life, a place where I didn't have to sleep with weapons under my pillow, where I could trust the people around me, where every stranger wasn't a potential threat. She smiled sadly. Seems impossible now. I've seen too much, done too much. That kind of peace isn't available to people like me. People like you? Killers, thieves, fugitives, women who've burned their bridges and salted the earth behind them. She turned to face him fully. I know what I am, Caleb. Know what I've become in the pursuit of revenge dressed up as justice. There's no going back from that. Maybe there is, and he said quietly. Maybe peace isn't about going back to who you were. Maybe it's about choosing who you want to become. Philosophical for a rancher. My father read a lot, some of it stuck. He met her eyes. I'm serious, though. When this is over, if you want a place to land while you figure things out, my ranch could use someone who knows how to handle trouble. And after what you've brought to my doorstep these past few days, normal ranch problems would probably seem downright boring. Leanne studied him in the darkness, her expression unreadable. You're offering me a job? After everything? I'm offering you an option. Take it or don't, but know that it's there. Caleb felt suddenly awkward, wondering if he'd overstepped. I just thought, you said you were tired of running. Ranch life isn't exciting, but it's stable, honest, the kind of place where you could catch your breath. And you'd trust me? After knowing me for all of 3 days? I've trusted you with my life multiple times already. Seems foolish to stop now. Before Leanne could respond, Cortez's whistle cut through the night, the signal for approaching riders. Everyone moved to their positions instantly, weapons ready, eyes straining against the darkness. 2 riders approached the ranch, moving slowly, their hands visible and away from weapons. As they drew closer, Caleb could make out details. A middle-aged woman in practical traveling clothes, her saddlebags bulging with what was probably camera equipment and notebooks, and beside her a younger man, barely into his 20s, nervously scanning the abandoned buildings. The woman called out as they reached the ranch yard. I'm Rebecca Walsh, senior correspondent for the Rocky Mountain News. This is my photographer, James Chen. We're here about the telegraph message. Who am I speaking with? Thornton stepped out onto the porch, his badge visible in the lamplight they'd positioned to illuminate the yard. Marshal Jack Thornton, Territorial Service. Are you alone? As requested. Walsh dismounted carefully, her eyes taking in the armed figures positioned around the ranch. Though I'll admit, this setup has me questioning my editorial judgment. Should I be worried you're about to rob me instead of giving me the story of the decade? Only story you're getting is the truth, Thornton said. Miss Joe, you want to show her? Leanne emerged from the house, the 3 ledgers held carefully in her hands. She approached Walsh slowly, giving the reporter time to see that she wasn't threatening, then laid the books on a rickety table someone had dragged onto the porch. These are Blackwood Syndicate's account ledgers for the past 5 years, Leanne said. Every bribe, every murder, every illegal land seizure, all documented in their own hand. Names, dates, amounts. Everything you need to bring down the most corrupt organization operating in the Western Territories. Walsh's eyes had gone wide. She stepped forward, pulled reading glasses from her pocket, and began examining the ledgers with the intensity of someone who recognized exactly what she was looking at. Her photographer began setting up his camera, the flash powder already prepared. This is... Walsh's voice was hushed, reverent. This is extraordinary. Do you have any idea what you've given me? A target, Leanne said flatly. Blackwood will do everything in his power to stop you from publishing. He's already got men watching your office in Denver. The moment you go back there, you'll be in danger. Then I won't go back there. Walsh was already taking notes, her pencil flying across the page. I'll telegraph the story to our sister papers in Chicago and San Francisco. Spread it so wide that Blackwood can't suppress it even if he burns down our Denver office. By noon tomorrow, every major newspaper west of the Mississippi will have this information. She looked up at them, her eyes bright with the fervor of someone who'd found their calling. But I need context. I need to know how you got these ledgers, who's been chasing you, what you've been through to get them here. That's what will make people care. What will turn this from just another corruption scandal into a story that demands action. So they told her. Took turns recounting the past 3 days. Leon's theft of the ledgers, the siege at Caleb's ranch, the mountain crossing, the ambushes, and narrow escapes. Walsh's pencil never stopped moving, capturing every detail, while Chen took photograph after photograph, preserving the evidence for posterity. Dawn was breaking by the time they finished, pink light spilling across the mountains and illuminating the abandoned ranch in shades of gold and amber. Walsh had filled an entire notebook and was starting on a second, her questions growing more specific as she verified details and cross-referenced the ledgers. "This is going to destroy them," she said finally, a fierce satisfaction in her voice. "Blackwood, every politician they've bought, every judge they've corrupted. Once this hits print, there will be nowhere for them to hide." "How long until publication?" Thornton asked. "The telegraphs will go out this morning. By tonight, the story will be in print in 3 cities. By tomorrow, it'll be everywhere." Walsh carefully packed the ledgers into her saddlebag, treating them with the reverence of holy relics. "You've done something remarkable here. Something that will literally change the course of justice in this territory." She mounted her horse, Chen doing the same. As they prepared to ride out, Walsh looked back at Leon. "What will you do now? After this breaks, you'll be the most famous woman in the West, the woman who brought down Blackwood." "I'll be the woman they couldn't catch," Leon corrected. "And I intend to keep it that way. Let the story be about the evidence, not about me." Walsh smiled. "I'll do my best. But you should know, you're a hero, whether you want to be or not. And heroes tend to attract attention, wanted or otherwise." They watched the reporters ride away, carrying with them the evidence that would reshape the political landscape of 3 territories. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, and for the first time in days, Caleb allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. "What now?" Hayes asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. "Now we wait," Thornton said. "Give the story time to spread, time to become too big for Blackwood to suppress. Once it's public knowledge, we're no longer targets. We're witnesses, protected by the very fame that Walsh mentioned. And if Blackwood decides to kill us anyway," Cortez's pragmatism cut through the optimism, "out of revenge, if not practicality, then we deal with it." Leon's voice was hard. "But at least we'll have won. The ledgers are public, the corruption exposed, the victims vindicated. Whatever happens to us after that is just the price of victory." They spent the day at the ranch, resting for the first time in what felt like forever. Caleb found himself on the porch as afternoon faded toward evening, watching the mountains and thinking about everything that had changed in just a few days. Leon joined him, settling onto the weathered boards with the easy comfort of shared exhaustion. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable enough with each other now that words weren't always necessary. Finally, she spoke. "That offer you made last night, about the ranch, does it still stand?" "Yeah," Caleb said. "It stands. I might take you up on it. Not forever, but maybe for a while. Until I figure out what comes next." She looked at him. "Assuming you still want a partner who brings gunfights and conspiracies to your doorstep." "Already had those. Might as well have someone around who knows how to handle them." He smiled. "Besides, ranch life is better with company. Even company that's more comfortable with pistols than plows. Well, I can learn plows. Might even enjoy it." Leon's smile was genuine, unguarded. Strange to think about after everything. A quiet life, honest work. No one trying to kill me. "Don't get too comfortable," Caleb warned. "Ranch life has its own challenges, drought, disease, market crashes, the occasional claim jumper. Just because it's not Blackwood doesn't mean it's easy." "I'll take ranch challenges over assassination attempts any day." They watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, orange and pink and purple bleeding together in patterns that seemed too beautiful to be real. And for the first time since stepping off that train in Copper Ridge, Leon allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next crisis, the next fight, the next desperate escape. It wasn't the future she'd planned, but maybe, she thought, it was the future she needed. The peace lasted exactly 18 hours. They were still at the Cameron Ranch when Cortez returned from a scouting run, his horse lathered and his face grim. He'd ridden a wide perimeter around their position, checking for watchers or signs of pursuit, and what he'd found had sent him racing back at full gallop. "They're coming," he said, swinging down from the saddle. "At least 40 riders, maybe more, moving fast from the south and east. They'll have us surrounded within the hour." Thornton swore, his hand already moving to check his weapons. "Blackwood's making his play. He knows the story's going public, knows he's running out of time to silence us before it's too late." "It's already too late," Leon said, though her voice was tight. "The telegraphs went out this morning. Walsh said the story would be in print by tonight." "Doesn't matter. Blackwood's not thinking strategically anymore. He's thinking revenge. We humiliated him, cost him everything he's built. Men like that don't let go just because the game's already lost." Cortez was already gathering his gear. "We need to move. Now, before they close the net." But Caleb was studying the terrain around the ranch, his mind working through possibilities. The Cameron place sat in a shallow valley with hills rising on 3 sides and a creek cutting through the eastern approach. It wasn't ideal defensive ground, but it had potential if they were smart about using it. "We can't outrun 40 riders," he said. "Our horses are exhausted, we're low on ammunition, and they know this territory as well as we do. We run, they'll run us down within a few miles." "So what do you suggest?" Hayes asked, his voice carrying an edge of panic. "We just wait here and let them kill us?" "We make them pay for every inch," Caleb pointed to the hills. "Those rises give us elevation and cover. The creek is running high enough to slow their approach from the east, and this ranch, falling apart as it is, still has stone walls and good firing positions. If we're smart about it, we can hold them off until dark, then slip away when they can't see well enough to pursue." "That's insane," Hayes protested. "You're talking about fighting 40 men with 5 defenders. I'm talking about not dying without a fight." Caleb looked at each of them in turn. "We've come too far, sacrificed too much to just give up now. Maybe we can't win, but we can make them hurt bad enough that they'll think twice about pressing the attack." Leon was nodding slowly, her tactical mind already working through the defense. "The ranch house is the key. Stone construction, limited approaches, good sight lines. We fortify it, stock it with ammunition and water, and make it a fortress. They'll have to come at us across open ground, and we make them bleed for every yard. And when they bring up dynamite or try to burn us out?" Thornton's question was pragmatic, not defeatist. "Then we fall back through the creek to the western hills and make them chase us through terrain that favors defenders." Leon was already moving, checking the house's structure and calculating angles. "It's not a perfect plan, but it's better than dying tired on some nameless trail." They had less than an hour to prepare, and they used every second of it. Caleb and Cortez fortified the windows with spare lumber and stones, creating firing ports that would protect them while still allowing clear shots at attackers. Hayes filled every container they had with water from the creek, both for drinking and for fighting fires. Thornton inventoried their ammunition, dividing it strategically so each position had adequate supplies. Leanne worked on creating fallback routes, identifying the best paths for retreat if the house became untenable. She also set several surprises: tripwires connected to warning bells, a deadfall trap on the main approach, and several caches of ammunition hidden along the escape route in case they needed to reload during a running fight. The riders appeared just as Cortez had predicted, materializing from the south and east like a dark tide. Caleb counted them through a crack in the shutters. 42 men, all heavily armed, spreading out to surround the ranch in a coordinated movement that spoke of professional military training. At their head rode a man Caleb recognized from Leon's descriptions, Marcus Blackwood himself, the architect of the syndicate that had terrorized 3 territories. He was older than Caleb had expected, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of face that might have been distinguished if it weren't twisted by rage and murderous intent. Blackwood stopped his horse just outside rifle range and called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Leon Joe, I know you're in there. You've made a terrible mistake, girl. Those ledgers were never meant to see daylight, and the people who helped you spread them are going to learn that some secrets are worth killing for." Leon moved to the window, her rifle cradled casually in her arms. "The secrets are already out, Blackwood. Every newspaper west of the Mississippi has them by now. You've lost." Lost? Blackwood's laugh was ugly, full of bitter fury. You think I've lost? You've cost me money and embarrassed me, but I'm still alive, still free, still protected by friends in high places. But you're trapped in a rotting house with nowhere to run. Who's really lost here? The man who rides all this way for revenge instead of accepting defeat with dignity. Leon's voice was calm, almost conversational. You could be halfway to Mexico by now, living out your days with whatever money you managed to save. Instead, you're here, about to throw away lives for pride. That's not strategy, Blackwood, that's desperation. The old man's face darkened. You want to see desperation? I'll show you desperation. I'm going to burn that house to the ground with you inside it, and when you're screaming for mercy, I'm going to laugh, because you took everything from me, and turnabout is only fair. He wheeled his horse around and shouted orders. The riders began to move, spreading into an even wider perimeter, cutting off any possible escape route. Some dismounted and began gathering brush and deadwood, clearly preparing for the fire attack Blackwood had promised. This is really happening, Hayes muttered, his hand shaking as he checked his rifle. We're really going to die here. Probably, Cortez said with dark humor. But let's try to take as many of them with us as we can. My mother always said if you're going out, go out memorable. Caleb took his position at the front window, where he had a clear view of the main approach. Beside him, Leon settled into her own spot, her movements economical and precise. She caught his eye and offered a small smile. Sorry about this, she said. When you were waiting for a mail-order bride, I'm guessing you didn't imagine it would end with a suicide stand against a criminal syndicate. Actually, I imagined something much more boring, maybe dying of old age after 40 years of peaceful ranching. Caleb checked his rifle's action one more time. But this has been educational. Can't say I regret it. Liar. You definitely regret it. Okay, maybe a little, but not all of it. He met her eyes. Meeting you, fighting beside you, seeing what real courage looks like instead of just hearing about it in stories, that part I don't regret. The imminent death part, sure, but the rest was worth it. Leon's expression softened. When this is over, if by some miracle we survive, remind me that I owe you a real conversation, one that doesn't involve gunfire and running for our lives. I'll hold you to that. The first attack came from the east, a probing assault meant to test their defenses and draw fire. 10 riders charged across the creek, their horses splashing through the water while the men fired pistols with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Caleb and Thornton met them with rifle fire, dropping 2 riders and forcing the rest to retreat in disarray. They're testing us, Leon said, watching the riders regroup. Seeing how much ammunition we have, how well we can shoot, whether we'll panic under pressure. The real attack will come soon. She was right. The second assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, riders charging from the south, east, and north, while sharpshooters on the hills provided covering fire. Bullets slammed into the stone walls, shattered windows, and punched through the wooden shutters they'd improvised for protection. Caleb fired methodically, picking targets and squeezing the trigger with the same careful precision his father had taught him. Each shot had to count. They couldn't afford to waste ammunition on wild shooting. Beside him, Leon was doing the same, her movements fluid and efficient as she shifted between targets. The attackers made it to within 20 yards before the concentrated fire from the house broke their momentum. Men fell from their horses, others wheeled away seeking cover, and the coordinated assault dissolved into chaos. But they'd accomplished something. They'd forced the defenders to burn through precious ammunition and revealed the positions of everyone inside the house. They'll use that information for the next wave, Thornton said, reloading with hands that were steady despite the circumstances. Try to concentrate fire on our positions. Suppress us while another group rushes the house. Then we shift positions between attacks, Leon said. Make them guess where we'll be. It'll slow our response time, but it'll keep them uncertain. The third attack was the one Blackwood had been building toward. While half his force lay down suppressing fire, the other half approached on foot, carrying bundles of brush and cloth soaked in kerosene. They were going to burn them out, exactly as Blackwood had promised. Caleb focused his fire on the fire carriers, dropping 3 before the rest made it to the walls. He heard glass breaking as kerosene-soaked torches crashed through windows, felt the sudden heat as flames began to spread through the house's interior. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, turning visibility to nothing. "Fall back!" Thornton was shouting, coughing as the smoke invaded his lungs. "To the creek! Move!" They retreated through the rear of the house, Leon covering their withdrawal with rapid pistol fire that kept the attackers at bay just long enough for everyone to slip out. The creek was shallow but fast-moving, its cold water a shock after the heat of the burning house. They splashed across and scrambled up the western bank, finding cover among the rocks and sparse trees. Behind them, the Cameron Ranch was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the sky as decades of weathered wood provided eager fuel. Blackwood's men were celebrating, convinced they'd killed their targets in the blaze. But their celebration was premature. Caleb could see the confusion starting to spread as they realized no bodies were visible in the flames. "They'll figure it out soon," Cortez said, water dripping from his clothes. "And then they'll come after us." "Let them come." Leon had already found a defensive position, her rifle trained on the burning house. "This terrain favors us now. They have to cross open ground while we have elevation and cover. We can hold here longer than we held the house." The next hour became a desperate game of cat and mouse through the western hills. Blackwood's men spread out, trying to flank them, trying to find an angle that would let them bring their superior numbers to bear. But the broken terrain and Leon's tactical expertise kept them at bay, turning what should have been a quick slaughter into a grinding battle of attrition. Caleb lost track of how many men he shot. His world narrowed to the simple mechanics of survival: find cover, acquire target, fire, move, before return fire could find him. Reload, repeat. His ammunition was running low, each shot now a calculation of necessity versus conservation. Beside him, Leon fought with the cold efficiency of a professional soldier, her movements precise and economical. She'd been wounded somewhere along the way. Caleb saw blood staining her jacket, but she showed no sign of slowing. If anything, the injury seemed to sharpen her focus, turning her into something almost mechanical in her lethality. Thornton and Hayes were positioned 20 yards to the south, their rifles creating a crossfire that caught Blackwood's men in a deadly envelope. Cortez had taken the high ground, his sharpshooting skills putting down anyone foolish enough to present a clear target. But they were losing ground, forced to retreat yard by yard as the attackers pressed their numerical advantage. Ammunition was critically low now. Caleb had maybe 10 rounds left, and he could see the others rationing their shots with similar desperation. The sun was setting, painting the burning ranch in shades of orange and red, and Caleb found himself thinking that if this was where he died, at least the view was spectacular. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this wilderness battlefield. Distant at first, then growing louder, the rhythmic thunder of many horses moving at speed coming from the north. Reinforcements for Blackwood, Caleb thought with despair. They were about to be overwhelmed. But the riders that appeared over the northern ridge weren't Blackwood's men. They wore federal badges, at least 50 of them, led by a man Caleb didn't recognize, a hard-faced marshal with iron-gray hair and eyes like winter ice. They swept down the hillside in a coordinated charge, their rifles already firing, catching Blackwood's men from behind and throwing them into complete disarray. The battle turned in seconds. Blackwood's forces, already exhausted from the extended fight and demoralized by their failure to finish off the defenders, broke and ran when confronted with fresh federal marshals attacking from an unexpected direction. Some tried to surrender, others simply fled into the gathering darkness, and a few died fighting because they were too stubborn or too loyal to do otherwise. Marcus Blackwood himself tried to run, spurring his horse toward the eastern hills. But Leon rose from her position, raised her rifle in a smooth motion, and fired one final shot. The bullet caught Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle and sending him crashing to the ground where federal marshals quickly surrounded him. The silence after the shooting stopped was almost painful, the absence of gunfire leaving Caleb's ears ringing. He stood on shaking legs, his rifle hanging loose in his hands, trying to process the fact that he was still alive. The gray-haired marshal approached them, his expression severe but not hostile. "Marshal Thornton, good to see you survived. When Judge Morrison got word from the Rocky Mountain News about what you were doing, he sent me and every available deputy to find you. Looks like we got here just in time." "Marshal Hendricks." Thornton's voice was hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "Yeah, timing could have been better, but we'll take it. Blackwood? Alive." wounded but stable. He'll stand trial for everything in those ledgers and probably hang for it. Hendricks' eyes moved to Leon. Miss Joe, I presume? You've caused quite a stir. Half the territory is calling you a hero. The other half is calling you a dangerous radical. Either way, you're famous. I just wanted to stop running, Leon said quietly. She was swaying slightly, the adrenaline fading and letting the pain from her wound assert itself. Is it over? Really over? It's over. The story's public, Blackwood's in custody, and every corrupt official whose name appeared in those ledgers is either fleeing or lawyering up. You've won, Miss Joe. Against all odds, you've actually won. Leon's legs gave out then, and Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. Her wound was worse than he'd thought. A bullet had caught her in the side, and she'd been bleeding steadily for the past hour. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Get a doctor, Caleb snapped at the nearest deputy. Now. Already sent for one, Hendricks said. We brought a medical wagon. She'll be fine. Tough as she clearly is. That wound's not fatal. She just needs rest and proper treatment. They carried Lion to the medical wagon, where a frontier doctor began working on her with the calm competence of someone who'd treated countless gunshot wounds. Caleb stayed close, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness, her grip occasionally tightening when the doctor's ministrations caused pain. Around them, the federal marshals were securing prisoners and seeing to their own wounded. The Cameron Ranch had burned to its foundation, leaving only stone walls and ash. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Thornton sat beside Caleb, both men too exhausted to do more than exist. Hell of a few days, the marshal said finally. That's one way to put it. Caleb watched the doctor work, willing Leon to be okay. You think it was worth it? All the death, all the destruction? Ask me that when we see how many corrupt officials get prosecuted. Ask me that when families start getting justice for what Blackwood did to them. Ask me that when the next criminal syndicate thinks twice before starting up because they saw what happened to this one. Thornton pulled out a flask and took a long drink, then offered it to Caleb. But right now tonight? Yeah, I think it was worth it. We did something that mattered. Caleb took the flask and drank, the whiskey burning down his throat and settling in his stomach like liquid fire. He thought about his ranch, damaged but still standing. He thought about his father's lessons about standing up to evil. He thought about Leon, who'd brought chaos into his carefully ordered life and shown him what real courage looked like. She's going to be okay, the doctor said, emerging from the wagon and wiping blood from his hands. Lost some blood and she'll be weak for a few weeks, but the bullet went clean through without hitting anything vital. She's tougher than most men I've treated, I'll give her that. Relief washed over Caleb so intensely it left him dizzy. Can I see her? She's sleeping, but yes. Keep it brief, though. She needs rest more than conversation. Caleb climbed into the wagon and sat beside Leon's cot. She looked small lying there, stripped of her weapons and the hard edge that usually defined her. Her eyes opened as he settled into place, still clouded with laudanum, but aware. Did we win? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We won. Blackwood's arrested, the story's public, and federal marshals are rounding up everyone involved. It's over, Leanne. You can stop running. A tear slid down her cheek, surprising them both. I don't know how to stop. Don't know what comes next. Next you heal. Then we figure out the rest. Caleb took her hand gently. That offer still stands. Ranch could use someone who knows how to handle trouble, and I could use a partner who isn't afraid of a fight. Partners, Leon repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that. Then it's settled. When you're well enough to travel, we head back to my ranch and start rebuilding, together. Leon's eyes drifted closed, but she was smiling. Together. That sounds nice. Caleb sat with her until her breathing deepened into genuine sleep, then stepped out of the wagon to find the world transformed. The federal marshals had set up a camp, their fires pushing back the darkness. Prisoners sat in guarded groups, their weapons confiscated and their futures uncertain. The burned remains of the Cameron Ranch still smoldered, sending up thin columns of smoke that twisted toward the stars. Cortez approached, a bandage wrapped around his arm where a bullet had grazed him. She gonna make it? Doctor says yes, needs rest and time, but she'll recover. Good. World needs more people like her, people willing to fight even when the odds are impossible. Cortez pulled out a cigarette and lit it, the match flare illuminating his tired face. What about you? What comes next for Caleb Vance, hero of the frontier? I'm not a hero, just a rancher who got caught up in something bigger than himself. Caleb stared at the stars, thinking about all the ways his life had changed in less than a week. But I'm going back to my ranch, going to rebuild what was damaged, and going to do it with a partner who makes life considerably more interesting. You and Miss Joe? Cortez smiled around his cigarette. That's going to be one hell of a partnership. Woman who can outshoot most men and a rancher stubborn enough to stand against the Blackwood Syndicate. You'll either build something amazing or kill each other within a year. My money's on amazing. Caleb found himself smiling despite the exhaustion, despite the pain, despite everything they'd been through. She's not what I was expecting when I sent for a mail-order bride, but she's exactly what I needed. The next few days passed in a blur of official statements, medical treatment, and slow recovery. Federal marshals took depositions from everyone involved, building cases against dozens of corrupt officials. Reporters arrived from Denver, San Francisco, and even as far as Chicago, all wanting to interview the woman who'd brought down the Blackwood Syndicate. Leon handled the attention with the same calculated precision she brought to everything else, giving interviews that focused on the evidence and the victims rather than on her own heroism. She deflected praise, redirected questions, and generally made it clear that she was done being the center of attention. A week after the battle at Cameron Ranch, they were finally cleared to leave. Leon was still weak from her wound but insistent on traveling, tired of being confined to a medical tent while the world moved on without her. Marshal Hendricks provided them with an escort, 6 deputies who would ensure they made it back to Caleb's ranch without further incident. The journey took 3 days of easy riding, giving Leon time to heal, and Caleb time to think about what rebuilding would entail. His ranch had been damaged in the initial siege, and he'd been gone for over a week. There would be work to do, repairs to make, stock to check on, but he wasn't facing it alone anymore. They crested the final ridge as sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and orange, and Caleb's ranch came into view. The walls still stood, though they bore the scars of battle, bullet holes, scorch marks, and one section where the gate had been partially destroyed. The house itself looked intact, its stone construction having withstood everything Blackwood's men had thrown at it. Leanne pulled up her horse beside his, studying the ranch with the same tactical assessment she brought to everything. It's a good piece of land, defensible, good water, solid construction. You've built something worth protecting here. We've built something worth protecting, Caleb corrected. You're part of this now, remember? Partners. Partners, she agreed, and this time when she said it, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Just acceptance and maybe even a little hope. They rode down to the ranch as the sun set behind them, their shadows stretching long across the desert floor. The deputies helped them unload supplies and see to the horses, then made camp a respectful distance away, giving them space to settle in. Inside the house, Caleb built a fire while Leon explored the rooms with careful steps, mindful of her healing wound. The place showed signs of the battle, broken windows, bullet holes in the walls, furniture overturned and damaged. But it was still standing, still solid, still home. I can help rebuild, Leon said, joining him by the fire. Once I'm healed, I mean. I know some carpentry, some stone work, and I'm a quick learner for what I don't know. I know you are. Caleb poured coffee from the pot he'd set on the fire, handing her a cup. But rebuilding isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about making something new, something better than what was here before. Is that your way of saying you want to expand, add buildings, increase stock? Maybe. Or maybe I'm saying that having a partner changes what's possible. Things I couldn't do alone, we might be able to do together. He met her eyes across the firelight. I spent 10 years focused on just surviving. Maybe it's time to start thinking about thriving instead. Leon smiled, genuine and warm. Thriving. I like the sound of that. They sat by the fire late into the night, making plans and sharing stories, slowly learning to be something other than fighters on the run. The transition wasn't easy. Both of them kept weapons close. Both of them startled at unexpected sounds. Both of them carried the weight of recent violence like stones in their pockets. But they were trying. And maybe, Caleb thought, trying was enough. Maybe peace wasn't something you achieved in a single moment, but something you built day by day, choice by choice, until one morning you woke up and realized the nightmares had faded and the future looked bright instead of threatening. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage and creosote, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. The deputies left at dawn, their horses kicking up dust as they rode back toward Denver with promises to check in periodically and assurances that federal marshals would maintain a presence in the region until the trials were complete. Caleb and Leon stood at the damaged gate, watching them disappear into the morning haze, and for the first time in over a week, they were truly alone. The silence felt strange after so many days of constant danger, the absence of gunfire and shouted warnings almost disorienting. Leon shifted her weight carefully, still favoring her wounded side, and Caleb saw her hand drift unconsciously toward where her pistol usually sat. "It's going to take time," he said quietly. "Learning to relax again. Learning that every sound isn't a threat." "I know." Leon dropped her hand, consciously forcing herself to leave the weapon holstered. "I've been fighting or running for so long that peace feels wrong somehow. Like I'm forgetting something important, missing some crucial detail that's going to get me killed." "You're not missing anything. We're safe here. The threat's gone." Caleb gestured toward the ranch. "Come on, let's start figuring out what needs fixing first." They spent the morning taking inventory of the damage. The main gate would need to be completely rebuilt. The fire and battering ram had destroyed it beyond simple repair. Several windows were shattered, their frames warped by heat. The stable roof had taken bullets that would need patching before the next rain. The corral fence had sections that were falling apart, and the water pump needed maintenance it had been denied during the chaos. But the foundation was solid. The stone walls had held. The house itself, while scarred, was structurally sound. It was fixable, all of it, given time and effort, and the kind of stubborn determination that Caleb had inherited from his father. "We'll need lumber," Leon said, making notes on a scrap of paper. "Nails, new hinges for the gate, glass for the windows, and probably some help unless you want to spend the next 6 months doing nothing but construction. There's a timber yard in Copper Ridge, and I know a few local ranchers who'd be willing to lend hands in exchange for the same when they need it." Caleb was already calculating costs and timelines. "We could have the essentials fixed within a month if we're lucky. And if we're not lucky, then it takes 6 weeks instead of 4. Either way, we get it done." He looked at her, seeing the doubt in her expression. "What is it?" Leon was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the damaged ranch with an expression that might have been guilt. "All of this destruction, all this damage, it's because of me. Because I brought war to your doorstep. You'd still have a functioning gate and intact windows if I'd never stepped off that train." "You're right," Caleb said, and saw her flinch slightly at the blunt agreement. "But I'd also still be alone, still living half a life, still pretending that survival was the same thing as living. You didn't just bring war, Leon. You brought purpose, reminded me that there are things worth fighting for beyond just maintaining what you already have. That's a generous interpretation of me nearly getting you killed multiple times." "It's the truth." He moved closer, his voice earnest. "My father spent his whole life teaching me about honor and standing up for what's right. But somewhere along the way, I forgot those lessons. Got so focused on just existing that I stopped actually living. You changed that. For better or worse, you reminded me who I was supposed to be." Leon met his eyes, and he saw something shift in her expression, the hard edges softening slightly, the defensive walls lowering just a fraction. "I don't deserve that kind of credit." "Maybe not, but you're getting it anyway." Caleb smiled. "Besides, we're partners now. Which means you're stuck with my gratitude whether you want it or not." A ghost of humor touched her face. "Partners. Right. I'm still getting used to that concept." "You'll have plenty of time to adjust." He handed her a hammer from the tool shed. "Come on, let's start with the corral fence. Even wounded, you can probably swing a hammer well enough to be useful." They worked through the day, falling into an easy rhythm despite Leon's injury forcing her to take frequent breaks. Caleb handled the heavy lifting while Leon did the detail work that required precision but not strength. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable. The kind that comes from shared purpose rather than lack of connection. By sunset, they'd repaired 2 sections of fence and cleared away the worst of the debris from the battle. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of everything that needed doing, but it was progress, tangible proof that the ranch could be restored. That evening, as they sat on the porch with simple dinner of beans and cornbread, a rider appeared on the eastern road. Caleb's hand moved to his rifle before he recognized the horse. It belonged to Tom Hendricks, a neighboring rancher whose property bordered his to the south. Tom dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he approached. "Caleb Vance, you stubborn son of a gun. Heard you were back. Also heard you've been having some excitement." "You could say that." Caleb stood to greet him, accepting a handshake that spoke of mutual respect built over years of frontier living. "Tom, this is Leanne Joe. She's my new partner." Tom's eyes moved to Leanne with the sharp assessment of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded and tipped his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to the neighborhood. Any friend of Caleb's is welcome at my table any time." "Thank you," Leanne said, standing despite the obvious discomfort it caused her. "Though I should warn you, my presence tends to attract trouble." "Already heard about that too. Whole territories talking about the woman who brought down the Blackwood Syndicate." Tom's smile widened. "Figure anyone brave enough to take on that nest of vipers is exactly the kind of neighbor we need out here. Territory's been under Blackwood's thumb for too long. Time someone reminded them that the frontier doesn't belong to whoever has the most money and guns." "It wasn't just me," Leanne said quietly. "Couldn't have done it without help." "But you started it. You took the first step when everyone else was too scared or too bought off to move." Tom pulled a folded newspaper from his saddlebag and handed it to Caleb. "Thought you might want to see this. Came in on yesterday's stage." Caleb unfolded the paper. The Rocky Mountain News, its front page dominated by a headline that made his breath catch. "Syndicate Falls. Blackwood Empire Crumbles Under Weight of Evidence." Below the headline was a detailed article by Rebecca Walsh, complete with photographs of the ledgers and a long list of officials who'd been arrested or forced to resign. Lan read over his shoulder, her expression tightening as she scanned the text. They published everything, every name, every crime, every bribe. "Not just them," Tom said. "Papers across 3 territories are running the same story. My wife has family in San Francisco. They sent a telegram saying it's front-page news there too. You've started something that's going to change how business gets done out here. Or it'll make me a target for every corrupt official who survived the purge," Leanne said, but there was no real fear in her voice, just acknowledgement of reality. "Maybe, but you won't be alone if they come." Tom's voice carried absolute certainty. "Word's getting around about what happened here, about how you and Caleb stood against 40 armed men and survived. Folks respect that kind of courage. You need help, you'll have it." After Tom left with promises to return with his sons to help with the heavier repairs, Caleb and Leanne sat in the gathering darkness. The newspaper spread between them. The article detailed not just the evidence from the ledgers, but also the journey to get them published, though Walsh had been careful to obscure certain details to protect those involved. "She kept her word," Leanne said, tracing a finger across one of the photographs. "Focused on the evidence rather than on us. Made it about the victims instead of the heroes." "That's what you wanted, isn't it?" "Yes, but I didn't expect it to work so well." She folded the paper carefully. "Marcus Blackwood's going to hang. They're calling for federal trials, bringing in judges from back east who can't be bought. This is really happening." "Your father would be proud," Caleb said quietly. "You got justice for him, and for everyone else Blackwood destroyed." Leanne was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion she usually kept locked away. "I spent 3 years learning to fight, learning to survive, planning revenge against people whose names I didn't even know yet. And now that it's done, now that I've won, I don't know what to do with myself. Revenge was all I had. Now I need to figure out what comes after. What comes after is building something instead of destroying it, living instead of just surviving." Caleb stood and offered her his hand. "And you don't have to figure it out alone. That's what partners are for." She took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. "I'm not very good at building things, or at living peacefully, or at trusting people." "Then you'll learn. Same way I'm learning that life can be more than just maintaining what my father built. He smiled in the darkness. We'll figure it out together. Make mistakes, fix them, and try again. That's what partnerships are. Two people stumbling forward together instead of alone. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern of hard work and slow healing. Leanne's wound gradually closed, the pain fading from acute to dull to merely occasional discomfort. As her strength returned, she threw herself into the ranch work with the same focused intensity she'd brought to everything else. She learned to handle livestock with a patience that surprised both of them, spending hours gentling skittish horses and tending to cattle with the care of someone determined to master a new skill. She learned carpentry from necessity, her hands becoming as comfortable with a saw and plane as they were with a gun. She even learned to cook, though Caleb diplomatically suggested she stick to simpler recipes after she managed to burn stew in a way he hadn't known was possible. In return, Caleb found himself learning from her. She taught him tactical thinking, how to see a property not just as land to work, but as terrain to defend if necessary. She taught him to read people better, to recognize deception and hidden agendas. She taught him that strength wasn't just about physical endurance, but also about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Neighbors came and went, helping with repairs and bringing news from the wider world. The trials were progressing rapidly. Federal prosecutors were building cases against dozens of officials, and the evidence from the ledgers was proving devastating. Several territorial governors had resigned rather than face prosecution. 3 judges had been removed from the bench. The entire political structure of the Western Territories was being reshaken, and the name Leon Joe had become synonymous with the kind of courage it took to stand against corruption. But Leanne herself remained quietly focused on the ranch, deflecting visitors who wanted to hear her story and avoiding the attention that continued to seek her out. She was done being the hero, done being the woman who'd brought down Blackwood. Now she just wanted to be Caleb's partner, building a life in the aftermath of the storm she'd created. 2 months after their return, Marshal Thornton rode up to the ranch with news that was both expected and still somehow shocking. "Blackwood's dead," he said without preamble, accepting the coffee Caleb offered. "Hanged 3 days ago in Denver. Federal judge presided, jury took less than an hour to convict. His last words were apparently that he'd done nothing wrong, that he was a businessman being persecuted by jealous competitors." "Still believing his own lies to the end," Leanne said quietly. She was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What about the others? The officials he'd bought?" "Trials are ongoing, but the verdicts are coming in guilty across the board. Your evidence was too solid, too detailed. There's no wriggling out of documented bribes and confessed murders." Thornton pulled out a thick envelope from his saddlebag. "Which brings me to why I'm really here. The territorial government is offering you a reward, $50,000 for services rendered in exposing the syndicate." Caleb whistled low. That was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to rebuild the ranch 10 times over and still have plenty left. But Leanne was shaking her head. "I don't want their money. Be smart about this," Thornton said. "That's enough to set you up for life. You've earned it." "I didn't do it for money. I did it for justice." Leanne's voice was firm. "Give the reward to the families Blackwood destroyed, the ones who lost land, lost homes, lost loved ones. They need it more than I do." Thornton studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I'll see that it's distributed fairly, but there's another matter. The territorial governor wants to meet you, publicly thank you for your service. There's talk of naming a town after you, putting up monuments, making you some kind of folk hero." "No." Leanne's response was immediate and absolute. "No monuments, no towns, no public appearances. I did what needed doing, and now I want to be left alone to live my life. Tell the governor I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not interested in being celebrated." "People aren't going to forget what you did," Thornton warned. "Your name's already in the history books. Songs are being written about the woman who stood against Blackwood. Let them write their songs about someone else, about the reporters who published the story, or the judges who convicted the guilty, or the marshals who made the arrests. Plenty of heroes to choose from. I'm done being one of them." She moved to stand beside Caleb, her shoulder brushing his. "I found what I was looking for. Peace, purpose, a place to build instead of destroy. That's all the reward I need." Thornton left shortly after, carrying Leon's refusal of both money and fame back to Denver. Caleb and Leon stood watching him ride away, the afternoon sun painting long shadows across the newly repaired ranch. "You sure about turning down that money?" Caleb asked. "50,000 could change your life." "My life's already changed. That money wouldn't have done it. Standing beside you, building this place, learning to trust again. That's what changed me." She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was no shadow of fear or calculation in her expression. Just openness, vulnerability, trust. "Besides, we're partners. Partners don't need government rewards. We've got each other and this land. That's enough." "More than enough," Caleb agreed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The seasons turned. Summer's brutal heat gave way to autumn's gentle cooling, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The ranch continued to improve under their combined efforts. New buildings rose where old ones had burned, the livestock thrived under careful management, and the land itself seemed to respond to the care they poured into it. Leon's nightmares became less frequent, the trauma of her 3-month flight, and the battles that ended it slowly fading into memory rather than constant present tense fear. She learned to sleep without weapons under her pillow, learned to relax into the ranch's routine without constantly scanning for threats. The hard edges that had defined her began to soften. Though the core of steel remained, she would never be someone who could be easily intimidated or controlled. Caleb found himself changing too, the isolation that had characterized his previous decade giving way to genuine partnership. Decisions that he'd once made alone were now discussed and debated, plans refined through 2 perspectives instead of 1. The ranch became truly theirs in a way it had never been, just his, shaped by their combined vision of what it could become. Winter came with unusual gentleness, bringing snow that painted the desert white but never stayed long enough to threaten the livestock. They spent the long evenings by the fire, Lian teaching Caleb to speak some of the Chinese her father had taught her, Caleb sharing stories of his youth and the lessons his father had imparted. They learned each other's histories, the small details and significant moments that had shaped them into the people they'd become. On a cold December evening, 6 months after Lian had first stepped off that train, they sat on the porch despite the chill, wrapped in blankets and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet around them, peaceful in a way that still sometimes surprised Lian with its simple beauty. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About that mail-order bride you were expecting, Margaret Chen. Whatever happened to her?" "I actually got a letter from her last month," Caleb admitted. "She ended up marrying a shopkeeper in Sacramento. Very happy, from what she wrote. She apologized for selling her ticket, said she'd panicked at the last minute about moving so far from everything familiar." "Do you ever wish she'd come instead of me? That you'd gotten the quiet, practical partner you were expecting instead of the fugitive who brought war to your doorstep?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, honestly considering the question. "No," he said finally. "Margaret would have been a good partner, I'm sure. Practical, steady, exactly what I thought I needed. But you're what I actually needed. Someone to shake up my comfortable isolation, to remind me that life is supposed to be lived rather than just endured. You challenged me, pushed me, made me better than I was. I nearly got you killed, multiple times. And I helped you finish something that needed finishing. Helped you find justice for your father and for everyone else Blackwood destroyed. We both got what we needed, even if neither of us knew we needed it at the time." He shifted closer, his shoulder pressing against hers. "Besides, life with you is never boring. That's worth more than comfortable predictability." Leon laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. "Never boring. That's certainly true, though I could do with a bit more boring and a bit less life-threatening crisis. Give it time. I'm sure we'll find a way to make boring interesting." And they sat in silence for a while longer, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the desert wind whisper through the sage. Finally, Leon spoke again, her voice soft but certain. "I love you, you know. Probably should have said it before now, but I'm not very good at this kind of thing. Spent too many years not trusting anyone, not letting myself be vulnerable. But you've been patient with me, given me space to heal and time to learn how to be something other than a fighter. So I'm saying it now. I love you, Caleb Vance. and I'm grateful every day that I stepped off that train and found you waiting." Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion, the simple declaration hitting him harder than he'd expected. "I love you too, Lianzhou. Have for a while now, even when I wasn't sure how to say it. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, even counting all the times you nearly got me killed." "Especially counting those times," Lian corrected with a smile. "Life-threatening experiences build character. Then I'm the most well-built character in 3 territories." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the quiet ranch and fading into the night. And then Caleb was kissing her, gentle at first, and then with growing passion, all the feelings he'd been carrying for months finally finding expression. Lian kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands tangling in his hair, 6 months of slowly building connection finally acknowledged and celebrated. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lian was smiling, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way Caleb had never seen before. "We should probably go inside," she said. "It's getting cold out here." "Probably," Caleb agreed, but neither of them moved, content to stay wrapped in blankets and each other, watching the stars and savoring the moment. Spring arrived with explosive growth, the desert transforming into a carpet of wildflowers that painted the landscape in impossible colors. The ranch thrived under their care, and word of their success spread to neighboring properties. Other ranchers began seeking Caleb's advice on livestock management and Lian's expertise on security improvements, turning them into quiet leaders in the local community. The trials in Denver finally concluded, with the last of Blackwood's co-conspirators sentenced to lengthy prison terms, or in several cases, the gallows. The territorial government announced sweeping reforms designed to prevent future corruption, though Lian remained skeptical about how long such reforms would last without continued vigilance. But that was someone else's fight now. She'd done her part, had her revenge and her justice. Now she was focused on building rather than destroying, on creating a life worth living rather than just surviving day to day. One warm April morning, as they were repairing a section of fence that winter storms had damaged, Lian stopped working and turned to Caleb with an expression of barely contained excitement. "What if we expanded?" she said. "Not just maintain what's here, but actually grow. Bring in more cattle, maybe start breeding horses. We've got the land for it, and with both of us working, we could handle a larger operation." Caleb felt a surge of pride at her enthusiasm, at how completely she'd embraced ranch life after spending so many years on the run. "We could. Would mean hiring some help, building more structures, but it's doable if we're serious about it." "I'm serious. I want to build something that lasts, something we can be proud of. Not just a ranch, but a real legacy." Her eyes were bright with possibility. "Your father built the foundation. We could build the future on top of it." "Then that's what we'll do." Caleb pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "Partners in everything. Building a future together." They worked through the day with renewed energy, their plans growing more ambitious as they discussed possibilities. By evening, they'd sketched out a 5-year expansion plan that would double their current operation and establish them as one of the major ranches in the region. It was audacious, maybe even a little crazy, but they'd faced down the Blackwood Syndicate and survived. Compared to that, building a successful ranch seemed almost easy. As summer approached, bringing with it the familiar desert heat, Caleb and Lian settled into their new reality. The nightmares that had plagued Lian's first months at the ranch were now rare, replaced by dreams of future possibilities. The constant vigilance that had defined her life was slowly being replaced by the comfortable routines of ranch work and partnership. They still kept weapons close. The frontier was too unpredictable to be completely relaxed. But they no longer slept expecting attack, no longer treated every stranger as a potential threat. The peace they'd fought so hard to achieve was becoming real, tangible, something they could build upon. On a hot July afternoon, almost exactly a year after Lian had first arrived, they stood together at the ranch's entrance, looking at the new gate they'd just finished installing. It was solid oak reinforced with iron, built to last for decades, a statement that this place was permanent, enduring. Carved into the wood above the gate were words Caleb had chosen carefully. Vance and Joe Ranch, built on courage, sustained by partnership. Lian traced the lettering with her fingers, her expression soft. "It's perfect." "We're perfect," Caleb corrected. "This is just wood and iron. What makes it matter is us, what we've built together. Partners, Leon said, the word now carrying layers of meaning it hadn't possessed a year ago. Partners in work, in danger, in survival. Partners in building and healing and moving forward. Partners in love and life, and all the messy, beautiful complexity that came with choosing to face the future together. Always, Caleb agreed. Whatever comes next, we face it together. They walked back toward the house, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon sun, and Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. A mail-order bride who'd never arrived. A fugitive in black who'd brought war and chaos and ultimately redemption. Battles fought and won, justice served, and peace finally achieved. It hadn't been the life he'd planned. It had been better. Behind them, the ranch stood strong against the desert landscape, a testament to survival and stubborn determination. The walls bore scars from the battles they'd fought, but they stood nonetheless, rebuilt and reinforced, ready to withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. Inside the house, Leon moved to the kitchen while Caleb tended the evening fire. They worked in comfortable silence, the easy synchronization of people who'd learned each other's rhythms and patterns. Dinner was simple but satisfying, shared across a table that had witnessed countless conversations about dreams and plans and possibilities. As darkness fell and stars emerged, they sat on the porch one more time, a ritual they'd maintained throughout the seasons. The desert night was alive with sound, coyotes calling, insects chirping, the wind creating its own music through the rocks and sage. "Do you ever miss it?" Caleb asked. "The excitement, the danger, the constant movement?" Leon considered the question seriously, not dismissing it out of hand. "Sometimes," she admitted, "there's a part of me that was shaped by those 3 years of running, that learned to find purpose in survival and meaning in resistance. That part occasionally gets restless with routine and predictability. But the larger part of me has learned something better. That building is harder than destroying, that peace is more valuable than excitement, that love and partnership are worth more than any amount of adrenaline." She took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "I don't miss running because I've finally found something worth staying for. Even on the boring days, when all we're doing is mending fences and checking on cattle. Especially on the boring days, those are the days that prove we've won, that we've earned the right to live normally after everything we went through to get here." She smiled in the darkness. "Besides, give us time. I'm sure we'll find new adventures. Maybe not life-threatening ones, but challenges worth facing nonetheless." Caleb laughed, knowing she was right. Life on the frontier was never completely peaceful. There would always be droughts to weather, harsh winters to survive, market fluctuations to navigate, and the 1,000 other challenges that came with ranching in unforgiving territory. But they would face them together, partners in every sense of the word. The years that followed proved Leon's predictions correct. The ranch grew and prospered, their careful management and combined skills turning it into one of the most successful operations in the region. They hired workers who became friends, built relationships with neighbors that deepened into genuine community, and slowly but surely established themselves as pillars of the local society. Leon's past occasionally caught up with them. Reporters wanting interviews, historians seeking first-hand accounts of the Blackwood Syndicate's fall, even the occasional curiosity seeker who wanted to meet the legendary woman who'd brought down an empire. But they handled these intrusions together, Leon politely but firmly maintaining her privacy, while Caleb supported her choices without question. The territorial reforms that had seemed so promising in the immediate aftermath of the trials proved partially successful. Some corruption was rooted out permanently, while other manifestations simply evolved into new forms. But the message had been sent. The frontier was no longer a lawless place where wealth and violence could operate unchecked. There were consequences now, and people willing to enforce them. 5 years after that first meeting at the depot, Caleb and Leon stood in almost the same spot, waiting for a different train. This time, they weren't expecting a mail-order bride or running from killers. They were simply meeting workers they'd hired to help with the spring branding, ordinary business for a thriving ranch. As the train pulled in and passengers began to disembark, Leanne leaned against Caleb's shoulder, comfortable and content in a way that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days of flight and fighting. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly, "for not turning me away that first day. for choosing to fight beside me when you could have walked away, for giving me a chance to become something other than a fugitive. You don't need to thank me. We saved each other, remember? I was just existing before you arrived. You taught me how to actually live." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "Besides, partners don't keep score. We just keep moving forward together." "Together," Leon agreed. The word now as familiar and comfortable as breathing. Always together. The workers they were expecting appeared, and they moved forward to greet them, slipping easily into the roles they'd built for themselves. Successful ranchers, respected community members, partners in every way that mattered. The past was behind them, memorialized in scars and stories, but no longer defining their present. The future stretched ahead, uncertain as all futures are, but no longer frightening. Whatever challenges came, they would face them the same way they'd faced Blackwood and his syndicate, together, with courage and stubbornness and the unshakable belief that they were stronger as a partnership than they could ever be alone. As they rode back to the ranch with their new workers, the sun setting behind them in shades of orange and gold, Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. A woman in black who'd stepped off a train carrying stolen ledgers and 3 years of accumulated trauma. A rancher who'd been waiting for comfortable companionship and instead found challenging love. Battles and sieges, mountain crossings and desperate stands, all leading to this moment of simple, hard-won peace. He wouldn't change any of it. Not the danger, not the fear, not even the moments when death had seemed certain. Because all of it, every desperate choice, every narrow escape, every impossible stand, had led him to this: a life worth living, a partner worth building with, and a future full of possibility. The ranch appeared on the horizon, solid and enduring, a monument to survival and stubborn hope. Home, in every sense of the word. Not just a place, but a partnership. Not just a building, but a shared dream made real through sweat and sacrifice and unwavering commitment. They'd started with nothing but desperate circumstances and impossible odds. They'd built something that would last, something that mattered, something worth fighting for and worth preserving. A legacy not of violence and revenge, but of resilience and redemption, and the transformative power of two people choosing to face the world together. As they passed through the gate, their gate, bearing their names and their values, Leon looked back one final time at the road that had brought them here. Then she turned forward, toward the house and the life they'd built, and didn't look back again. The past was done. The future was waiting, and they would face it the only way that mattered, together, partners until the end, building something beautiful from the ashes of everything they'd survived. The wrong bride had arrived on that dusty depot platform a lifetime ago, armed and dangerous and carrying enough trouble to destroy everything Caleb had built. But she hadn't destroyed anything that mattered. She'd saved him instead, given him purpose and partnership, and a reason to believe that courage still counted for something in a world that often seemed determined to reward only corruption and violence. He hadn't gotten the bride he expected. He'd gotten the partner he needed. And that had made all the difference. The sun set completely, stars emerging to paint the desert sky in familiar constellations. Inside the ranch house, lights flickered to life, warm and welcoming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to prove that they'd earned their peace and would defend it with everything they had. But tonight, they had this moment, hard-won, deeply cherished, and absolutely worth every sacrifice they'd made to achieve it. They had each other, their partnership forged in fire and tested beyond any reasonable limit. They had their land, their legacy, their future. They had won. And they would keep winning, one day at a time, building their shared life with the same stubborn determination that had allowed them to survive everything the world had thrown at them. Not because it was easy, but because they'd learned that the best things never were. Because they'd discovered that true strength came not from fighting alone, but from choosing to stand together, no matter what darkness might be waiting just beyond the light. The story that had begun with chaos and gunfire ended with peace and partnership. The wrong bride had become the right partner, and the rancher who'd been waiting for someone to share his life had found someone to share his soul instead. In the end, that was all that mattered. The rest was just details, stories to tell around winter fires, lessons learned and wisdom earned through trial and survival. But the core truth remained, unshakable and eternal. They had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and built something beautiful anyway. That was their victory. That was their legacy. That was enough.